I have finished season 2 of MASH with my MASH retro reviews. This is going to be my review compilation video. So each episode will be timestamped down below if you want to jump around. But before we actually get into that, let me give you my general thoughts on season 2. So season 2 I don't believe is going to be my favorite season, but has a lot more good moments than I remember from before this rewatch. Lots of great jokes in that, but also some misses. A lot of that stuff will be elaborated when I talk about each episode, so we might as well just jump on in and see that stuff. And also, next week, I won't be doing a MASH retro review, I'll be taking a break, but the week after is when we're going to come back with Season 3, Episode 1. So please stay tuned for that, but in the meantime, enjoy the rest of the video. We're moving on to the second season for my MASH retro reviews, because today we're talking about Season 2, Episode 1, Divided We Fall. So like I mentioned, we're now on to Season 2, and because it's a new season, they basically reintroduced the concept of the show. They reintroduced our characters. And they did this through the premise of HQ, specifically General Clayton sending a psychologist to evaluate all the characters to see if the unit needs to be split up because they're all, mad, crazy, cracked under pressure, that kind of stuff. Of course, we know that doesn't happen at the end, obviously going in, but that's the framing device to reintroduce everything, the premise of the show, i.e. bunch of drafted doctors during the Korean War and their zany antics that they get up to stay sane. That's effectively the premise of the show. And of course, reintroduce us to our characters. And also, there's some hallmarks of some of the other plots that are going on. No, the plots where Hawkeye and Trapper play pranks on Frank. Yep, there's reference to that. Reference to Klingers wearing dresses to try to get a Section 8. Yep, they throw that in there. Them, saving the day, being good surgeons. Yep, that's being referenced there. And not just saving the day, i.e. saving lives, but saving the day in the sense of something bad is going to happen, they're going to get arrested or something. But by being good doctors, the bad consequence does not happen. All that is done in this episode. There's a few other things probably mentioned too, because there's a lot of different plots, but all those do get a reference somehow in this episode in the in reintroducing the plots. Now, there is one thing I do want to note. At the end of the episode, we're talking about all the characters. They do reference Klinger as being a part of the cast. Now, he's a recurring character. But notice, he's still not a main character yet, but the ending kind of makes it feel like it. But that's happened in other episodes where there was a significant guest character who we never saw again. Or maybe was supposed to be a significant character, but we never saw again. So we do eventually see Klinger again, and he does eventually become a main character. But I thought that was kind of interesting. Meanwhile, no Father McKay at all. Another character who's not a main character yet, but does have a significant screen presence. Just a little thing I thought I would touch on. Overall, it's a good episode because it's a basic episode. They're reintroducing everything, so they're going to put their best foot forward. And while, yes, I do prefer the later seasons of MASH, this is a really good early season episode because I feel like the humor was well good and the more problematic aspects are not given too much airtime, but at the same time I kind of wish they did to properly address them, but that's a whole big issue that's going to deserve its own separate video. But in the meantime, I would love to hear your thoughts on Divided We Stand in the comment section down below. So I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with the second episode of the second season, 5 o'clock Charlie. And because of that, this video is coming out at 5 p.m. instead of 3 p.m. But anyhow, this is one of the classic episodes of Season 2. Premise: a North Korean pilot keeps on trying to bomb the ammo dump that's near the camp, and Frank is actually wanting to do something about it. Meanwhile, Hawkeye and Trapper are like, no, we don't want to do anything about it because if we shoot him down, real planes rather than biplanes that may actually hurt the patients might end up showing up. So they have some valid concerns, but Frank is all gung-ho and kind of ignores that. But everyone's, except for Frank and Margaret, is betting on how far 5 o'clock Charlie will miss by, including General Clayton. So yeah, the people at headquarters know what's going on, and they're in on the betting pool. And General Clayton, he's like, he doesn't agree to Frank's need for a gun until his Jeep is blown up. Go figure. But really, there's also great fun jokes now. There's a lot of great fun jokes here. Hawkeye and Trapper have an extended scene where they're speaking in a full British accent, mainly during the first time when the stage is being set in the episode for who 5 o'clock Charlie is. And then Margaret and Frank and that are freaking about an air raid, even though everyone knows what's going on and nobody actually gets hurt. So they're all wearing their helmets. And so they're not taking shelter though doing it, they're still watching. Because they know they're not in any real danger, but they're acting like it because it's what they're supposed to do. A little bit of, playing up to the social expectations for what the military expects, even though nobody at the 4077 is actually following those expectations except for Frank and Margaret. Could we analyze that? But I'm not going to because this episode is supposed to just be a fun episode. And how does this situation end? Well, simple. Frank does get his gun, and what does Hawkeye and Trapper do? Well, they try to make it easier for 5 o'clock Charlie to hit the ammo dump. Still fails, but because of giving confusing numbers, the anti-aircraft gun is pointed right at the ammo dump, and Frank, not paying attention, orders the gun to be fired because he wants to shoot down 5 o'clock Charlie, even though 5 o'clock Charlie does not need to be shot down. And so Frank basically orders the ammo dump destroyed when he orders the gun to be fired. Go figure. It is hilarious. By the way, there's also another hilarious scene where basically Trapper is pretending to be dressed up as MacArthur, and then Hawkeye's partially in his dress uniform, and then Radar's carrying a yardstick, and by the way, Hawkeye's carrying a golf club, and they're just making a mockery of what Frank is trying to do. And yeah, because Frank is trying to meet fire with fire, and actually he's not. He's trying to meet a match with fire. Totally different things going on there. One is relatively harmless, and the other is like, ooh, that could cause some pretty big backlashes. But yeah, so that's essentially the premise and the jokes of the episode and how it ends. Like I said, this is one of the classic episodes of early MASH. Just a great fun romp, and that's what it really does boil down to. That's what I got to say, so I want to hear from you. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 3, Radar's Report. So this is basically another one of those, a character is writing to somebody and we're seeing what they're writing about, which is the story that unfolds. So we've had, people writing to family and all that, but this time it's, the weekly report that Radar's filling out for Henry, and then Henry has to sign. And actually that's one of the gags in the episode. At the very end, Henry is finally able to sign the report because, the report is done, and he says, let me actually read this one because you never let me read anything you give me to sign. And that is a very common thing we see in MASH, or at least in seasons 1, 2, and 3, where Henry just signs whatever is put in front of him. So we get that some done. There's some nice scenes with Radar, no typing, where the one scene he moves his notes on top of the typewriter, so he then uses the adding machine, I guess it is. Just like, come on, like, okay. Just a fun little gag there. But let's actually talk about what's going on. So, unlike some of the other ones where a character is writing about the ongoings and it's a series of small but disconnected vignettes, these really are connected. Well, actually, 2 of them are connected. The third one isn't. So you have this, basically go on the OR with a Chinese patient who is, rightfully scared out of his mind and reacting accordingly. Does accidentally contaminate another patient and injures the nurse. But you can understand why he was acting, scared, because, you wake up in a room of people you don't recognize, and especially, if the only time you've ever seen Americans were propaganda posters, you're probably going to freak out. Probably lots of Americans whom would have woken up in the operating room in Asia, especially after propaganda, they probably react that same way too. Quite understandable. And then, of course, Hawkeye is flirting with the nurse, and man, he's really smitten for this nurse because apparently he's even talked about the potential of marriage. Weirdly, he does take a pause when he sees that she has a ring on. That's never stopped Hawkeye before. But maybe it's because he was so smitten, he actually was actually truly caring about what she wanted, even though he talked about it before checking if that's what she actually wanted. There's a lot of different ways you can look at that, but one way is they're slowly starting to try to make him seem less of a womanizer, but still haven't quite gotten there yet. That's one way of looking at that scene. Another way is, the writers just thought that was going to be a fun bit. And it was a fun bit, so it can go either way, but I kind of like the idea that they're slowly trying to flesh out Hawkeye's character and not being so much of a womanizer, though still bit. Trap was patient that was contaminated because of the Chinese soldier who contaminated by destroying the last bottle of blood of that blood type. The patient doesn't make it, so Chopper considers revenge. Hawkeye tucks him out of it. But the part of the episode I really want to talk about is the Klingo part of the episode, in which Sidney Freeman makes his first appearance. He's brought in to evaluate Klingo to see if he can qualify for a Section 8. Now, I do want to just one thing. Match's continuity is always all over the place, and that includes Sidney's name. Apparently, in this episode, they credited his character as Milton Friedman, but they go with Sidney later on. Match continuity for you. But what's going on is he evaluates Klingo and tells him that if he signs a document where he admits to being a transvestite and a homosexual, he will get his Section 8. But Klingo refuses. Why would Klingo, someone who is so set on getting out of the army, refuse it being given to him on a silver platter? Well, it's not a silver platter. Well, it might be silver plated, but it's lead. The reason is we gotta look at the history of the times. So MASH is set in the 1950s, and it was filmed and created in the 1970s. Remember how I said he wasn't just given a document to say that he was crazy, but that he admits to being a transvestite and a homosexual. Nowadays, depending on where you are in the United States, and truly depending, it's not generally a big deal. A guy wearing women's clothes, not a too big deal. Women wearing guys' clothes, even less of a big deal. Really, for men, it's more of only performances. While with women, they can just throw on a pair of shorts and a t-shirt and no problem. But back in the 50s, and even the 70s, wearing the clothes of the opposite gender, especially for guys, was a huge, huge social faux pas. It could literally destroy lives. Same thing back then, being labeled as homosexual, as gay, could totally destroy your life. A good historical example, Alan Turing. He was very important with computing and also with breaking the Enigma code that the Germans used during World War II. And when it came out that he was gay, his life was utterly destroyed. And Klingo, they portrayed him straight. And both straight in the comedy sense, where the only thing comedic about him is his dresses and wearing women's clothing. But other than that, he plays it straight. He's just a guy wearing dresses. That's how Jamie Farr played Klingo. They played him straight. And that also, because he's not putting on a gay, girly accent or anything like that, that's also portraying the character as straight. So, I think it's safe to say that Klingo is straight, especially considering that he does get married twice in the series by the end. The reason why I want to bring that up is, if Klingo is straight, as the text suggests, strongly suggests, mind you, and he's only wearing dresses as a bit to get out of the army, admitting to being homosexual would totally destroy his life. It wouldn't be him coming out of the closet, it would be destroying his life. And even if he was gay back then, you didn't admit it because it could destroy your life because of the way society was at the time. It's so unaccepting of people living those lives and being that. That's how things were in the 1950s and still in the 1970s. That is just some very important context for why Klingo doesn't sign and leaves. Now, if it was just admit that you're crazy, yeah, Klingo would have signed. And by signing and admitting he's crazy means he wasn't crazy and he probably wouldn't have gotten into Section 8 anyhow. Now, MASH covers some of these topics better on in later episodes, but this is really probably the first time where it's seriously brought up. Now, they don't mention why Klingo objected, and that's probably because MASH was a product of the times. Everyone watching it in the 70s would have known what that meant. But if you're watching it today, and you're from a fairly liberal area, you may not realize what the implications of Klingo saying that he was that stuff back in the 50s actually meant.
But that is
There's actually some interesting social commentary that they didn't quite fully address, but just hinting at the most serious topics that MASH would later talk about. But those are just my thoughts. Yes, I'm leaving on that note. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Hey there, it's JohnBerry555, and I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with my review of Season 2, Episode 4, For the Good of the Outfit. So when I started watching this episode, I was like, I don't remember this episode. And then I watched it and was like, oh yeah, I remember it now. Why did I forget it? Because it's kind of an important episode. There's a very serious undertone to the main plot, though they did portray this a lot more humorously than I think they would have in later seasons. But there's pretty much one plot, not really any B plots in that. The closest thing to a B plot is Frank in the background eventually deciding to do the right thing and side with Hawkeye and Trapper. What's that thing? Well, episode opens with him operating on some Korean civilians whose village was shelled, and Hawkeye and Trapper suspect it was American shells, and it was. And so the story is them basically trying to get the army to admit responsibility and to take corrective action, i.e. compensate the victims. And then the B plot is kind of, Frank not wanting to do it because, he's more regular army, and it's definitely more with the mindset that the U.S. Army, the U.S. can do no wrong, but he also eventually sees, oh, it would be good if I actually stood up for what is right in his kind of selfish way. So that's the premise of the episode and not what's going on. But the thing is, the army does not want to admit responsibility. Shocker. And that's something I want to talk about. This episode, I'm not sure if it was after any significant massacres during the Vietnam War, but definitely Tao Lin, I think. I might have the wrong Vietnamese town, village. But there was a pretty infamous massacre during the Vietnam War. Some of it I know was tried to be swept under the rug, and there might have been others that weren't swept under the rug, but the army tried to do it. Basically threatening Hawkeye and Trapper with basically getting their lives ruined if they continue doing this, transferring the guy from the Inspector General out to Hawaii so he couldn't, putting the wrong information out in a press release and Stars and Stripes, all that kind of stuff. Which, you know what, I bet the army still probably does things like that today. And the episode ends on Frank finally decides to do the right thing, probably because of pushing for Margaret. And, well, what ends up seems like the army will admit responsibility. Unfortunately, the ending bit of the episode does not confirm anything. But what it does do is follows up on Hawkeye trying to send a letter to his father talking about the situation and trying to get his senator to do something about it. So the ending bit is a joke that Hawkeye's home state senator was just indicted on corruption, therefore won't be of any beneficialness. And apparently Hawkeye's dad committed election fraud. Okay, about the ending bit. The joke that the senator was corrupt, fun. The joke that Hawkeye's dad committed election fraud, maybe back when this was made, might have been a little more powerful, but recently, that kind of humor is not as fun anymore because of all the allegations we have had in the news and all that. Don't want to really get into it, but I'll just say this. Biden did legitimately win in 2020. Enough about US politics current day because we're talking about MASH. Like I said, this episode has a very serious subject, but it was undercut by a lot of jokes. And that ending joke, even though I saw the joke, with the senator being actually corrupt and therefore won't be able to help them, and probably wouldn't have helped them anyhow, was a good joke. I feel like that is symbolic of how the jokes in this episode undercut the seriousness of the topic. Still a good episode. I actually did laugh at a lot of the jokes. Like, there's a scene where Henry is drunk while Hawkeye and Trapper are meeting with General Clayton. Okay, it's funny. It kind of undercuts, but, Henry's very much presented in this episode like, he does not want to deal with this at all. So it makes sense he's drunk, so it makes sense in the episode. But some of the jokes, did feel like undercut the seriousness of this episode. It would have been very interesting to see the cast and crew take another stab at this type of episode later on when MASH got more serious. In my memory, they didn't, but I would have loved to see it because I think they might have had something more insightful to say than they said in this episode. But those are just my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 5, Dr. Pearson, Mr. Hyde. So in this episode, Hawkeye goes crazy. And he goes crazy. In all honesty, he probably should have been sent home after the what he gets up to. He's also sleep deprived in this episode, but it's because they get non-stop casualties, and he's not sleeping. Yeah, he's still performing surgery pretty well, but because of the lack of sleep, he goes crazy, and given what we know later on, maybe indicating some underlying craziness, but yeah, he's sleep deprived, overworked, tired, and just not sleeping for days straight. To the point where even Frank is recognizing that Hawkeye is, not in a state to operate. Yet, he's still operating successfully. I think that just shows how good of a doctor Hawkeye is. But really, it gets to the point where pretty much everyone in the camp is like, something needs to be done with Hawkeye because he needs to, at the very least, go to bed. And finally, Trapper and Radar successfully drug Hawkeye with something to sleep him. They sedate him, basically. They first tried to inject him with some type of sedation medicine. They accidentally give Frank. Of course they do. And eventually they spike a martini, and that's what gets Hawkeye to finally knock out. Though it takes some time. He's able to, in that time, successfully get a Jeep, actually an ambulance, get some chains, and hook up to the train to take it to North Korea. Yeah, that's what Hawkeye is doing. And you know why? Because in his sleep-deprived state, Frank's bad explanation of why the Korean War started leads Hawkeye to believe that if he just gives the North Koreans a latrine, that's going to end the war. The war is a lot more complicated than that. Really, it was a lot more complicated. I'm not going to get into here, but I might do that as a later video. But yeah, Frank made a bad explanation. He tried to walk it back, but he should have recognized that Hawkeye was not in the right state to understand that he was being figurative and giving a bad explanation. But yeah, so because of Frank, Hawkeye decides the easiest way to end the war is to give the North Koreans a latrine. Oh, by the way, the General Clayton, is in the latrine when Hawkeye is taking it away. Thankfully, Hawkeye only gets like 500 meters before the sleeping pills kick in. Don't get long enough. And the episode ends with Hawkeye sleeping, and then Trapper playing some solitaire, and Colonel Blake's also there as well. And basically, they're like, what are we going to do with him? The ending punchline is if they all had some kind of sense, they would get on the first latrine nowadays. So that's a joke, but I mean, that is actually works within the episode, because that ending joke, when Henry says, if we were in the right mind, we would all get on the first latrine now to fill, does make sense given the context of the episode. But it does underlie something maybe a little more important, that in order to survive and be in the war environment, you kind of have to be just a little bit crazy, because no sane person would stay in such a condition, basically. So that's what that ending joke kind of says. It's kind of weird, but kind of makes sense as well. In all honesty, there's another episode later on in MASH where Hawkeye is again sleep deprived, but they bring in Dr. Friedman, Sydney, and so that way they're able to help him through that. Kind of wish we could get Sydney again in this episode. He was in the previous episode already, evaluating Klingo, and it would have been great to see him again, because this would have been a good video to bring in an actual psychologist. But alas, they didn't do that for the story, and for this story, it didn't really make sense. But when you think about it, this episode is touching on some harder-hitting stuff that will become more prevalent later on. Characters, doing crazy antics because they're suddenly going crazy. Characters, trying to end the war. There's another episode where Hawkeye tries to end the war too. So I kind of like that episode a little better, because I feel like Hawkeye's reasoning and all that is more grounded in the sense of he has a breaking point with the war itself. Here it's portrayed more as a effect of being sleep deprived. So some of the later breaks for him with trying to, and Sick of the War and Want to End of It, make a little more sense in my opinion. But this is still a pretty good episode and does touch on some more serious topics while still having some humor. In fact, speaking of humor, I already mentioned the ending joke, and there's some other jokes as well, but some of the lines that would have had a laugh track in other episodes, I don't think I heard a laugh track. Unless I accidentally turned it off. But like I know there was multiple lines where people are telling Hawkeye go to bed, and he basically says you too. Basically the idea that they wanted to go in bed with him. But to my knowledge, there was not a single laugh track. And I feel like that's something that the studio executives and the network executives would have demanded. So somehow they were able to, for some of those lines, not include a laugh track, which is quite interesting. And I think it's hinting that they wanted this episode to be a little more serious than some of the other episodes. But those are just my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 6, Kim. So this episode, a Korean boy ends up at the camp injured, and basically everyone in the camp falls in love with him, and Trapper decides, since they can't locate his family, that he'll and his wife back home will adopt him. The episode ends, I'm just going to jump to the end, is that doesn't happen because the local orphanage run by Sister Teresa, which I think this might be the first time they've actually mentioned her. And when the few... No, wait, no, she was in Turtle. That's right. Don't know if it's the same actor or not. But regardless, she locates Kim's mother and they are reunited. So, really good ending, but it still was shown to be melancholy because, the adoption did not occur. Now, this episode reminds me very much of another episode way later in the series after Frank has left and we have Charles there. Very similar premise, though. That episode dealt a lot more with a lot of the red tape that would have come up. They made a mention to that, but that was not the purpose of this episode. The purpose of this episode was to show the camp falling in love with this young, about 5-year-old Korean boy. Everyone, really, even Frank. Frank is a bit childish during all of this, because Margaret is watching Kim on their night. He's a bit not happy about it, but at the same time, when Kim accidentally wanders into the minefield, he recognizes that's not good, and does show that he does have some care. Again, not enough, in my opinion, but that's Frank. Frank is not good about caring about others. That's just the fact of his character, and why he works as a good foe to Hawkeye and Trapper, who almost kill too much at times. And bringing in that other episode from later on, I forget which season, I'll talk about that later on, but with Charles kills as well. Another why he's such a different character than Frank, but Charles doesn't show his care. Well, so basically, what I'm getting at is, when Frank shows that he's caring about something, that either means he's trying to get something about it, or he actually genuinely cares. You don't know which. So I think in this episode it's a genuine care. But when Charles shows that he cares, he really cares. But again, I'll talk more about that in that later episode. But this was just a sweet, wholesome episode. Really, maybe my only problem with it is how there was one line that does revolve around, and this mentality still be around, but that only women can take care of children and men can't take care of children. That's a very common stereotype and belief that many people do hold. So just to set the scene for that, Hawkeye is reading to Kim from a book, definitely not a child-appropriate book, in post-op. And of course, Margaret and Frank come in, kind of to spoil the fun and all that. And when, I forget which one of them asks, but no, that Hawkeye is disturbing the other patients, Hawkeye then asks, "You want me to stop?" And everyone else in post-op says no, because they're as interested in, yeah. Meanwhile, and then there's a line that basically about who should kill for the boy, protect him, and Margaret basically says, I'm a woman, or something along those lines. I forget the exact wording. I know, I just watched the episode and I forgot the exact wording. But the point being, that scene is implying that only women can take care of a child and not men. But the episode also does show that that's not entirely the case, because every single character has some kind of moment with Kim. Major character. Radar has his moment. I mean, it involves Radar's teddy bear, but they're both basically passing back and forth while they're trying to sleep. You have Margaret reading to Kim, the three bears, the Goldock and three bears, if I remember correctly. You have Trapper looking to adopt him. You have Henry basically playing with the child, but also talking to his sister Teresa on the phone and making it sound like the boy is still recovering. Hawkeye has his moments as well, reading to the child and post-op. And I'm sure a bunch of other characters too had either small moments or even moments that if this was an hour-long episode, we probably would have gotten to see. And so the episode does dismiss the idea that men can't take care of a child, not as strongly as I think it would have been neat, but the point really of this episode was a sweet, wholesome story of the camp falling in love with this young Korean boy who was injured by the war. That's what the purpose of the story was, and you know what? It was sweet and wholesome. And you know what? It's good that Kim got reunited with his mother. That is, in all honesty, the best way to end this episode, because the episode was about the wholesomeness this boy brought to the camp. While that later episode with Charles was that wholesomeness was still there, but was about how the Army's bureaucracy is hurting their ability to care. And so the ending had to be different in that episode, more bittersweet rather than wholesome. There's some bittersweetness in this episode as well, but still just a good, fun, wholesome episode. But those are just my thoughts on it. I would love to hear your thoughts on the episode, Kim, in the comment section down below. I'm continuing my MASH retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 7, L.I.P, or Local Indigenous Personnel. So like I said, this is the 7th episode of the 2nd season of MASH, and what's the premise of it? Well, Hawkeye is, one, trying to get on a date with a nurse, trying to get to home base, and also helping a corporal, Bellinger, I think it was, basically, who had met a local Korean lady named Kim. They fell in love, had an unofficial marriage ceremony, and had a baby. Trying to help them get married officially, so that way when the corporal ships home, his entire family can go with him back to the United States. Those are the two plots going on. There's also a kind of a third plot intent for humor regarding that the movie that they'll keep on expecting does not arrive, so they have to make do with what they actually have. So, it's actually a really good episode. I could easily see this being done much more seriously in later seasons of MASH, but still, the topic is serious because there is a lot of opposition to the corporal and Kim, which is the name of the lady, which by the way is kind of confusing because the last episode was about a different Korean named Kim who happened to be a young boy, while this one involves a Korean lady named Kim. Kind of complicated. Why did they do that? So like I said, that part, the main story, is treated very seriously. Hawkeye's doing his best he can to get the paperwork expedited, but you know, paperwork is going on. So a person from CID, which is basically the armies in the 1950s, I think it might still be called CID, but basically their internal intelligence agency and all that. Basically there's a lot of stuff about the hoarders, and of course Frank objects, so does Margaret. It makes sense that, especially with this time of frame for writing, that both of those characters would object, though I will say they once again played the line where they go in to complain, Henry doesn't want to see them, which is common, but where Margaret does all the talking and Frank doesn't say anything. The first time that happened was a couple episodes back, which I think was done better because of Henry's lines and regarding basically if Frank don't say something, people perform an autopsy. That was a good funny joke to end that segment, that bit. But here I don't like the ending as much because it's basically the ending where Frank mentions his wife and then Margaret fake cries and runs away. I can kind of tell when Loretta Swift was directed as Margaret to fake cries, there was she's clearly fake crying. She has much more better crying scenes elsewhere in the show. I suspect that was one of her favorite scenes to perform. I could be totally wrong about that, but whenever Frank mentions his wife and Margaret overhears, she cries and all that and runs away, but it never feels like she's genuinely upset, more like she's overacting that she's upset. Again, that could be partially done for humor, or perhaps the writer Swift did not care for those jokes and therefore did not put in as much effort. Like, there's other scenes, especially later on, where she's directed to cry for a scene and it's so much more realistic. You feel for her. Here, you don't feel for Margaret. Which we kind of should, because she's being strung along by Frank all this time. But again, that's another matter, and there's going to be other episodes where we'll be talking about Frank and Margaret's relation in more detail, where it's going to make more sense with the story going on. But I did want to mention it because of how they used that bit to end another bit, and how using that bit to end the first bit did not work out in the humor of the show. But anyhow, eventually the CID man comes, and basically Hawkeye, during his interview with the man, gets the man drunk, and Hawkeye could pick up pretty easily that the guy was not interested in improving at all, i.e. because of racism. And of course, so him and Chapel make some blackmail, and it does work. So the CID man does pick up on it. If it was Colonel Flag, then not going anywhere, but it wasn't Flag. Who knows if Flag is actually CID, CIA, or something else. That's another joke that we're going to be talking about later. But anyhow, so they frame him, and the man agrees to sign, and then Hawkeye finally gets on his date with the nurse he's been having a few small dates with, but not getting to home base. Anyhow, as soon as Hawkeye explains what's going on, the nurse is basically like, you basically, stirred her, claimed that Hawkeye stirred her up in order to help one of the soldiers marry a quote gook unquote. I put that in quotes for a reason. That is basically a slur. It's not basically, it is a slur. And when Hawkeye hears that, he calls the date off. He leaves her, and his last scene with her, he sticks his tongue out at her. And that's showing Hawkeye's character, showing that, he actually cares about him and the corporal and that, he's not a racist. She's a racist and he can't stand that, so he breaks up with her. They've only gone on 3 dates, but he still breaks up with her and doesn't want to see her anymore, doesn't want to get you home base with her. So, while Hawkeye is, especially in these early seasons, portrayed as a very promiscuous character, very willing to go to bed with any nurse, he does have a line where he's not going to cross it. One of them being, he's not going to get with somebody he knows to be a racist. So, that's one of the very serious things, and that's almost the end of the episode, after everything else is get done. But the last scene of the episode ends on the wholesome note. Forget about the nurse being racist. Forget about Frank and Margaret opposing it, likely for racist reasons. Forget about the CID man who he needed to blackmail to do the right thing. It ends with Father Mulcahy performing the official ceremony to officially marry the couple and Kim, so that way they can be officially married, and she and the child can go to the States with him when he is sent back home. That's how the episode ends, which is a good ending. That's nice, positive, happy note, showing that even when you have the opposition from people who oppose it, whether for bureaucratic reasons or racist reasons or who knows what other reasons, there's a bunch of other reasons we can throw out there, that in the end, when people who care about doing the right thing stand up for the right thing can be done. But that is where I'm going to end my review. I hope to hear your thoughts on this episode in the comment section down below. I'm continuing my series of Master Retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 8, The Trial of Henry Blake. So the premise of this episode is that Henry is put on trial, a preliminary hearing for a court-martial, to see if he's basically fit to command and if the charges put forward by Frank and Margaret actually will stick, or do they have merit. And the charges are basically unfit for command, all that, things like, allowing Klinger, a transvestite, to be around the camp. Klinger is just doing that to get out of the army. Everyone knows that. That's literally his bit. And everyone just accepts that he's doing it. but because he does his job, they don't care. They have, gurney races, and all that. And like, again, one of Frank Henry's defense is that, hey, it's a morale building thing, which is, yeah, building morale, but there's a more serious charge, i.e., giving aid and comfort to the enemy or treason. What's actually going on? Simple. Henry's putting some extra requisitions so that way they can give some basic medical necessities to a local nurse who's running a clinic that helps save lives of newborn infants. And the problem for Frank and Margaret, apparently the clinic is no for the 38th parallel. And this clinic is not giving aid and comfort to them. In fact, medical personnel are supposed to give medical aid to the enemy. If I remember correctly, it's against the Geneva Conventions to deny enemy soldiers, enemy personnel medical treatment. Now, you're supposed to take them prisoner afterwards, if I remember correctly. But, yeah, giving aid and comfort to the enemy in terms of medical stuff is allowed. It's just, you generally should probably keep them prisoner. But regardless, Frank should understand what it means to be a doctor. But then again, this is Frank after all. Anyhow, do you know how they resolve it? Well, they get Miss Craggy to show up. That's the nurse to testify. She brings one of her patients who is expecting, and as a visual demonstration of how the medical supplies that Henry has provided to them is helping them to save lives, to save the lives of newborns. And the panel decides, yep, we're going to drop our charges if Frank will agree. Well, Frank doesn't want to agree until Hawkeye puts a note in front of him, basically saying that they're going to tell his wife that him and Margaret are having an affair, and that gets them both of them to agree not to do it. Of course, there's a bunch of other stuff going on, such as Frank and Margaret putting Hawkeye and Trapper under house arrest in order to prevent them from, putting evidence forward in favor of Henry, which actually, according to the MASH wiki, is against the military code of conduct, because false arrest and impeding an investigation. And again, Frank would not make a good commander. I mean, he's literally having the rocks painted white, which is against air code regulations. Margaret points out to him that no, he can't technically do that. So what does Frank do? Just paint the top half, so that way it can be turned over every night. And this is not the only time Frank will do it. We'll see Frank having the rocks painted white again in the future. But there's this one line right before Frank has Hawkeye and Trapper arrested, where Frank says they'll soon have a real man in charge, and Hawkeye and Trapper go to congratulate Margaret. Now, that's played off as a joke, but the thing is, Margaret would be a better CEO than Frank ever could. Even her right now, where she hasn't really grown into her compassionate side yet, where she hasn't had really any good role models, she's already gonna be a better leader than Frank. It's demonstrated in this episode where she knows that they can't paint the rocks white. She knows it's against the regulations because of air raid safety. And so while that line was intended to be a joke, it does show some truth. Hawkeye and Trapper recognizes that Margaret would be a better leader, even though they're intending to insult Frank. The thing is, they're insulting Frank because it's true. Frank is not a good leader. They go AWOL on him to save Henry because they know he's going to be a bad commander. While Frank tries to make that look bad on Henry, the thing is, he was in active command at the time of the 477. It's going to be bad on him. He's not a good commander. He does not inspire loyalty in his men. He does not inspire confidence. The fact that Klinger's trying to get out would probably double under Frank because Frank is a bad commander, a bad leader. He does not exhibit any leadership qualities. But we'll see that in the episode, the Novocaine Mutiny, when we get to that, though. We got a bit to go. I think that might be after going to partialize. But in the meantime, I would like to hear your thoughts on the episode, The Trial of Henry Blake, in the comment section down below. I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 9, Deal Dat 3. So this is the third time we get Hawkeye writing back to his father, describing what's going on in the camp, and this time he's explaining the mundane, the stuff they're doing with the boat. So, in fact, there's some pretty fun stuff going on, like, parties, volleyball games in the background, home movies. Yeah, Henry gets some home movies of his daughter's birthday party, and it ends with them holding up signs saying that they miss him. So sweet. And Hawkeye literally says, if you don't get the order to cry, Henry, I will. And then it goes into more of a joke, but Henry, back home before he was shipped out, just, messing around, showing off, having fun with their neighbors, clearly acting, but clearly they're all in on it. Like some just good, wholesome stuff that people who are friends associate with. Of course, there's other stuff going on. Trapper and Henry playing a card game because they're so bored. Which, by the way, Trapper wins and claims he cheated, and that's the only way he could win. Which Frank was insulted by that, but Frank, you should have taken it the other way. Obviously, Trapper was messing with you, but still, you should have taken it the other way. But why would Frank think that? There's no more on the darker element, but having to remove a unexploded grenade from a soldier. Just a bunch of stuff that they do, comedy going on. And then there's the overarching vignette story part. There's also the monthly staff meeting, which apparently they haven't had in 6 months, and the last time it did go on, only Richter attended. And apparently, in the last meeting, they tried to vote on holding an annual meeting, annual reunion afterwards. And did anyone vote for it? No. So that means the person who proposed it didn't vote for it. We also learned Frank's middle name is Marion, which Trapper and Hawkeye make fun of him for. And really that scene is just goofing off, really. But Hawkeye does get this one line that if they're talking about things related to surgery, he'll take it seriously. He just won't take the military seriously. And then there's even a joke in there that General Eisenhower is running for president, and Hawkeye said in his letter, some people do anything to get out of the army. So those jokes are, but there is one element that's overarching these jokes, weaving through them. Not necessarily supporting the jokes, but providing an overarching narrative in addition to Hawkeye's letter back to his father. I'm dropping a voiceover here because I didn't like how I originally recorded the second half of my video, so I scrapped it. I'm doing voiceover just to make it easier on me, so thumbnail time. Anyhow, so what I was going to talk about is still what I'm going to talk about, but I hope I'm going to phrase it better in a way I personally like and feel more comfortable putting out. If you want to see my original version, let me know. I might put it out for channel members. We have to wait and see. But anyhow, so what I was going to talk about the plotline with Sergeant Corden. So Sergeant Corden, he's a wounded soldier. He comes in, Hawkeye and Nurse Ginger are operating on him, and it's time to close, so Hawkeye asks Nurse Ginger to get some more blood for the sergeant, and after Nurse Ginger walks away, Hawkeye is told by the sergeant not to give him the wrong blood, i.e. blood from African Americans. Now, the sergeant uses a racial slur. I'm not going to repeat it because I do not want to repeat any slurs. Even though it's not what's considered the most offensive one, all racial slurs are still offensive. But the fact that he used even a soft slur, and I'm putting that in air quotes, does show that this sergeant is racist. And he doesn't want to give the wrong blood because of his racist mentality. Anyhow, Hawkeye tells Trapper this, and they hatch a plot to basically teach the sergeant a lesson, I believe as Trapper says, some reverse prejudice. So they get a solution to darken his skin, so yes, they do use some blackface in this episode. I don't know quite how I feel about it, but they're using it to target racists, not to target victims of racism, so slightly better, I guess. I don't know. If you feel more comfortable sharing, let me know what you saw, because I felt uncomfortable, but I did like that they were not making fun of Black Americans as is traditionally done with blackface. And I do want to mention, during this, Nurse Ginger and Klinger are also in on Hawkeye and Trapper's plot. Klinger purposely plays into the sergeant's fears to make him convinced he got the wrong blood that would turn his skin darker. Not a thing at all, but in the sergeant's racism, which is inherently illogical, he believes it. And then, of course, Nurse Ginger, who, mind you, is black, that is kind of important, congratulates him on being marked down as white, i.e. to say that he's passing. If you don't know, that term basically refers to an African American, or really anyone of any racial group or societal group in some form, who's able to pass as a member of a dominant group in order to avoid racial prejudice and other forms of discrimination. And the point being is trying to get a sergeant to realize he's in the wrong for his his opinions. Granted, he freaks out and all that, and this Ginger, who's also a lieutenant, so Lieutenant Ginger shuts him down, pulling rank. This is going to be important later on. There comes another scene where Hawkeye brings in the sergeant's meal. Now, this is a stereotypical meal. Stereotypes are always harmful. Even the so-called positive stereotypes still are harmful, especially if you don't live up to a positive stereotype. Stereotypes harmful no matter whether they appear positive or negative. But anyhow, that stereotypical meal, chicken and watermelon, has and was, and probably still isn't, depending on the group, associated with Black Americans. Now, the reason why they did this is they wanted to provoke the sergeant to realize the racial stereotyping and prejudice that he had. And then they tell him a story of Dr. Drew. I forget his first name, but this doctor was important in developing procedures and all that for blood transfusions and separating the blood from the plasma. Very important stuff. The story, as Hawkeye tells the sergeant, is that the doctor got in an accident and wouldn't be let in the hospital and died of his injuries, and he wasn't let in because it was a whites-only hospital. So, literally telling him that you're only alive because of the work this doctor did, and this doctor died because of racial discrimination. The Dr. Drew was African American. Now, I do want to address something. This story has been shown to be false. While it was a whites hospital he was sent to, by all accounts from the fellow doctor who was in the vehicle with him, he got his treatment. Now, MASH did not know this when they were writing this episode. This story, the doctor related in the 80s, I believe. I did want to just throw that in there, but even if MASH had known the truth, one, the truth wouldn't have been known when the show was set, and two, that would have defeated the purpose of why Hawkeye and Trapper were telling Sergeant Colden that story. They wanted him to get to think on how negative and how harmful racial prejudice and discrimination can be. And the episode ends with Sergeant Colden entering the swamp during a social event and carrying his rifle. So we're wondering, is he going to lash out? No. He goes up to Hawkeye and thanks him both for patching him up, but also for giving him some stuff to think about. Then he goes to address Lieutenant Ginger, also thanks her and renders her a proper salute while addressing her by her rank. It's showing that, at the very least, he's gained some respect for people of a different race than him, at least for the positions they held and honor they are due. Hopefully that will extend beyond, so hopefully he'll treat a private who happens to be African American with the same respect that he showed Lieutenant Ginger, but it's a step in the right direction for a guy who had racial prejudice. I'm going to take a cue from Santa Claus is Coming to Town, the song One Foot in Front of the Other. Well, Kris Kringle tells the Winter Warlock being good is as easy as taking your first step, i.e., you just got to start somewhere and go from there. So, this is actually a really important message for MASH to show. It's showing not only that racial prejudice is bad, saying it's no, don't do that, but it's also showing that sometimes you got to get people to see from a different perspective for them to begin the process of change. In later seasons of MASH, they'll address this plot in different ways, the idea of dealing with a racist character, but this is one of the few times where I believe they legitimately helped the character become a better person by the end of the episode. Most times they just managed to get the officer off the line somehow, which is still good, but actually invoking change in the character, and I really do like that. Now, that was a lot, but I would love to hear your thoughts on Dear Dad 3. It was a heavy episode of a serious topic, but lots of brevity. And that's something I've discovered a lot with these early seasons of MASH. There's a lot more serious topics being touched on than I remembered. Just sometimes there's a joke that undercuts it. They did not do that in this episode, which I think shows how seriously they took this main topic. They didn't undercut it with a joke at the end. So I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 10, The Sniper. Before I jump into this review, I will be doing an update video in the coming days where I'll be explaining why I haven't been uploading videos, and this video is actually delayed as well by a day, but it still has been delayed. But oddly, the events of this episode weirdly relate to why I was delayed, but not quite. But I wasn't under fire or anything, but I was in a position where I was not able to access my normal stuff going on. Again, that's going to be its own update video, but this episode, weirdly, the fact that trapped in a situation where you don't know quite when things are going to return to normal, that is definitely relatable to me. But let's actually talk about the episode. So the 477 is under fire by a sniper, and shenanigans, hijinks ensue. Not too much, but there's the small stuff. You got your panics, you got your jokes you try to deal with. Henry and Radar are trapped in the showers. Radar loses the towel that's giving him some privacy. I've read that was supposed to be a blooper, but at the same time I could see them actually trying to do it. So who knows how that one actually was supposed to go. But there's other stuff too, like actually kind of a heartfelt moment between Hawkeye and Frank of all characters. Now there is no Frank being frank about the fact that he failed medic school 2 times, that he's a bit of a coward. And yeah, that's kind of very much true for Frank, and also highlights how Hawkeye and Trapper do not respect Frank as a doctor, and they don't respect him as an officer either. But Hawkeye basically gives this 99 out of 100 times. A hero is someone who's just too cold, tired, hungry to give a damn. Which I think is often the case. You got nothing else to do? Might as well just do it kind of mentality. And yeah, and there's again several other scenes too. And of course they call regimental headquarters for help. So eventually, they do get a chopper to come up. The sniper's flushed out and injured, but Hawkeye, showing that he's a doctor first and foremost, grabs his medical bag and goes to tend to the wounded North Korean sniper. Frank, meanwhile, says, well, he fired on our flag of truce, let's fire on his. And they did try to do that. They made a white flag, and they went out so they could get some wounded that came in and hopefully end the siege that the sniper is putting on them. Of course, the sniper fired on the flag, so the sniper did commit a war crime, then Frank advocated that they commit a war crime in return. And that's why it's appointed not to commit profanity or a false surrender, or ignore somebody's surrender, because, yeah, that creates problems. But yeah, so that's the gist of the episode. I really love this episode. I love that it's serious. And there's some jokes, yes. There's some jokes to relieve the tension for us, the audience. But a lot of it is, you can definitely tell the characters are also experiencing the tension and they're trying to relieve it, but not always with success. And that's really the bulk of the episode. But there's one other important thing I want to mention. Frank's lack of gun safety. Frank, never put your finger on the trigger. Keep it on the trigger guard if you're going to hold it like that. And of course, Hawkeye and Trapper, while they don't call him out for his lack of trigger finger discipline, they do call him out on improper gun safety, pointing it willy-nilly. He didn't even have the safety on. But Frank's supposed to be incompetent at a bunch of stuff, so that makes sense. And the joke is that he's dumb for handling a gun that way, and you shouldn't be like Frank. So I'm fine that they showed it, because it's being that dumb for gun is just dumb to do, and they rightfully make fun of being that dumb. Granted, there's another episode where Frank has, improper trigger discipline as well, but that's when BJ gets here and BJ's foot gets injured, then I remember. But it might have made some more sense in some ways if there was actually a consequence. As you know, Frank did accidentally discharge the gun twice. Basically, Ray just snuck into the mess tent to get some food, and Hawkeye and Frank saw that, and they saw it was the North Korean sniper getting food. And Frank, fires his gun without paying attention to what he's shooting to. Again, don't be like Frank is a big part of what Mash is saying. Be more like Hawkeye. Hawkeye, like I said, at the end of the episode, grabs his medical bag, second to last scene of the episode, grabs his medical bag and goes to treat the sniper. And of course the ending joke, and of course the ending joke is that the sniper thought the 477 was MacArthur's headquarters, and that's why he was firing on them. But he was just a cold, hungry kid who didn't know what he was actually doing. really good way of ending the episode. Also dressing Frank up as General Costa before him realizing it. Again, kind of a good fun joke to end the episode, and shows these are characters also trying to deal with it in a certain way through humor. And you can tell Trapper and Hawkeye, they have sympathy for the sniper because they see him just as a young kid who made a, foolish decision, was dragged into the war that he shouldn't have been a part of, and that probably shouldn't have been really going on. We can break more down the Korean War some other time, but war is always a tragedy, no matter what. But that's all I got for you today. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. So I'm carrying on my series of Mash Retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 11, Carry On Hawkeye. See what I did there? Yeah. This episode, very much, I felt like I should have watched and reviewed during the COVID pandemic, because there's a flu epidemic going through the camp. Everyone's getting sick, and pretty much the only people who are not getting sick are Hawkeye, Margaret, and a handful of nurses. Raider also and Father McKay also managed to stay healthy, but Trapper is the first surgeon to go down with the flu, then Henry, then Frank. Now, both Trapper and Henry do try to get back, but they end up back in bed very quickly. And of course, Frank, well, he's probably the worst hit of all of them because, he basically gets somewhat delusional while he's sick. But really, what I really like about the opening of this episode is how everyone in the camp is wearing masks, or most of them are wearing masks, exercising proper precautions to prevent the spread of the flu. Then, of course, we get into the meat of the episode, and all of a sudden, they're only wearing masks in surgery. Guys, if you're attending to sick people, and you don't want to get sick, you probably should be wearing masks. Now, that is likely an effect of they didn't want to keep the actors' faces hidden for the entirety of the episode. Which makes sense. Actors generally want their faces to be seen. It's a big part of how they get parts, the headshots and all that. And of course, if there's a later episode, Dreams, where it's, a larger surgery, but the dream sequences, no masks. So that's, I think, why they chose not to wear masks during most of the episode outside of the opening scene establishing that the flu is going through. And of course, apparently, they're not the only place where the flu is going through, because they can't find any replacement surgeons, which Radar tried, called all over. Hawkeye even called, nobody. And of course, that actually kind of does reflect the the crisis at the beginning of the pandemic, where doctors were the ones and nurses were the ones who were getting sick initially, because guess who were responding and treating the pandemic? Now, obviously, when they wrote this episode, COVID was not a thing. But you know what was a thing? The 1918 Spanish flu. Only called Spanish flu because Spain was the only country during World War II during World War I to report on it, because they weren't involved, so they weren't doing press censorship like it was done by the US back then. But still some fuzziness because we don't have the best records from back then. But the point is likely the authors were probably thinking of as a Spanish flu, or if I remember correctly, there was another flu pandemic in, I want to say, the early 70s. Now, or that might have been actually after this episode. But there was another flu pandemic between the Spanish flu and the COVID pandemic before the 90s, before the show went off the air, if I remember correctly. But they could have easily been thinking back to that, or just any time where there's a higher increase in the flu, like, cold and flu season. But this episode really does draw those parallels. The doctors are still, and nurses, well, Hawkeye and the nurses, because Hawkeye's the only doctor who is still healthy. But even by the end of the episode, he gets the flu, but he still carries on. Because he has to. There's no choice. Because really, the only two people who have once Henry, Trapper, and Frank go down with the flu, who have the best medical experience who could cut and do surgery, is Hawkeye and Margaret. Now, Margaret is a nurse, and her training does not involve doing that. And of course, there's a bunch of medical ethics rules, though, in a crisis situation. So, guess who's the nurse who's doing the most actual surgery? It's Margaret, because it makes sense. She's the head nurse. She's the most experienced nurse. She's probably seen the most operations, so if anyone can do it, she can. Granted, she also takes over the administration of the camp, all the paperwork and stuff, which Hawkeye was perfectly willing, but Margaret, guess what she does? She keeps on going like Hawkeye is not letting her, and Hawkeye comes, I've never encountered such a sore window before. But the thing is, she probably was legitimately expecting Hawkeye to give some pushback. Probably because Frank would give pushback, is my guess. Or even she would give pushback if somebody who she believes, if she was in a command and someone she believed wasn't supposed to be in command was trying to take command. So there could be a lot of stuff there, but I did think that was an interesting scene. And then, of course, there's another interesting scene right after Hawkeye admits that he's pretty sure he has a flu to Margaret. He says that he wants to get better so he can say all the mean, nasty stuff to her all over again. But in some ways, that is, especially early on, how the relationship is. You can definitely tell, though, respect is forming between them as clearly medical professionals in a way that wasn't there before. They always had some, but it feels stronger now. Granted, there's later episodes that really foment their friendship and establish what it is like. But there's one line where right after Hawkeye tasks Radar to scrub up so that way he can assist in just holding stuff and handing tools, medical instruments, he gives Margaret a compliment, and Margaret's response is, he's very sick. Like, she couldn't, like, the idea that Hawkeye was complimenting her for her basically her medical skills and all that was not something that she, at that time could see coming out of his mouth, given the fact that he's, always trying to flirt. And he's still trying to flirt when he's sick, given the fact that he's generally very dismissive of a lot of stuff, especially dismissive of Frank's medical skills. But the thing is, time will show again and again that Frank is not the most skilled surgeon out and the most skilled doctor. But everything shows that Margaret is a skilled nurse. So it does make sense. But the thing is, Hawkeye rarely shows it to Margaret because he does not respect her military authority. But this episode shows that he does respect her medical ethics and her medical skills and medical authority. Just, probably if not for the flu, he may not have admitted that, though that's getting into some speculation and stuff. But really, I do love this episode. I really love, while they don't tackle anything seriously, I love seeing the camp in that position, in a position where they still gotta do their job, patch up wounded soldiers, get them better, prevent them from having any, deaths. But at the same time are dealing with illnesses themselves that prevent them from being able to operate at their full capacity. That's something I really like seeing, the struggle. It's, yes, there's jokes in here, but the joke is not at the flu situation. Most of the jokes are the same jokes Hawkeye tells anyhow. Him dealing with being in the war. And there's some other jokes too, but really, this is just a good episode. I don't necessarily want to call it a fun episode. The jokes are not too big, but I really just like it. Probably one of my favorite episodes in terms of storyline, because there is a very basic storyline. The doctors are all coming down with the flu, and of course the nurses have not had the proper medical training and legally and ethically should not be conducting surgery. But in the time of crisis, where with only one actual surgeon, what do you do? And the thing is he runs himself ragged and lets himself get the flu, but he still continues operating despite being sick, which he probably shouldn't have done, but he was still standing unlike all the other doctors. So that is where I'm going to end my review, but I would love to hear your thoughts on the episode Carry On Hawkeye in the comment section down below. So I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 12, The Incubator. So let's just address the premise of the episode. The 477, Hawkeye and Trevor, have decided they need an incubator. So just to cover it, basically a culture of germs so they can identify diseases. Pretty simple. You think it should be equipped at a field hospital. Nope, they have to send it to Tokyo, 72-hour waiting period before they hear results. So yeah, you can see why they want that, because 72 hours is quite some time. But of course, there's hiccups. One, they wake up the first day drunk, hungover after a party that they don't remember. And so, they get through to Henry, doesn't take much. But of course, the Quartermaster Cole says no. So they go up to a Major who says no, who's also has 3 incubators, but doesn't want to let them go, because if he uses it, because he's not using it, it breaks, then he only has 2. And he can't have that, and he can't just have 2 because 3 is better than 2. But he's not using them. Then they go to a coroner who's corrupt, wheeling and dealing, selling stuff. Just crazy. Then they go to a general, because the general, they definitely do a little bit smarter. Doesn't get them anywhere, but they go during a press conference to get and the reporters are now asking questions. Of course, because of what Hawkeye and Chopper did. And now they're in trouble on like 50 counts, of course. In the end, guess what? Radar finds them an incubator. And guess what he did? He traded Colonel Blake's Henry's new barbecue, it's really a grill, for a incubator. So now they have to figure out how to use an incubator to cook steak rail. So that's the premise of the episode. It's a good, fun episode. Even has one of Hawkeye's most sincere salutes, but it's not really sincere because he's just trying to get on the Major's good side. So he's acting. An actor acting. What a novel concept. But yeah, so like I said, there's some good, clever, fun jokes. Frank berates them after the party, though he tries to refrain from doing it, but they basically goad him into berating them. There's several other things as well. Granted, I do want to kind of maybe address more of the meta of the episode, the idea that a hospital does not have an incubator, and I think it was one of the nurses, I think, beginning with an credited, beginning with an O, if I remember correctly. I honestly need to pay better attention to that stuff. But it says that the reason why they don't have it is because it's logical, it makes sense. And there was another thing too, but basically the army can't have things that are logical and make sense and would actually be beneficial. Yet they allow a grill and a pizza oven. Yeah. Apparently they can also get a pizza oven and an inflatable pool. So luxuries that boost morale, but luxuries that make more effective medicine are apparently going too far. Now, I do want to say, yeah, red tape is a nightmare. It can be for getting supplies and all that. But I will have to say one thing. Keeping up the morale of troops is really important. If you don't have good morale, things are not necessarily going to go well. So, yeah. Just so keep that in mind. So that's probably why a lot of those luxuries that boost morale are allowed, but why don't they allow a luxury that boosts medical stuff going on? Really, the only thing I could say is that being a mobile army surgical hospital, the 477, having something as complicated as an incubator that they need to move is considered too much of a hassle, though they have to move wounded patients when they evacuate. We haven't seen any bug outs yet in the series, but that's at least a reason. But in all honesty, would be a dumb reason. But you know what? That would be fitting of a MASH episode to say that you can't have this because you have to move it. But they didn't do that, but you know what? It's still a good, fun episode overall, and I would love to hear your thoughts on the incubator in the comment section down below. So I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 13, Deal Me Out. So, let's just jump into the premise of the episode. They're having a poker game. Hawkeye, Chopper, Henry, Klinger, and of course, Sidney Friedman is there, and another character, Captain Sam Pack. I think we've seen him in the future. Does that make sense? I honestly don't remember if he's been in previous episodes. The way he's shown is like, oh, we shouldn't recognize who this character is. Obviously, recognize Sidney, even though this is his second appearance. We had him before, though. His first name was said Milton in that his first appearance. Early installment Wilderness, but he's Sidney in this episode. We also get our first appearance of Colonel Flagg. Or do we? Because it's actually not Flagg. It's the same actor, Edward Winter. But the character he's playing is actually a different Army intelligence officer named Halloran. Now, Flagg could be CID, could be CIA, we don't know. There's a lot of craziness around him, but the fact is, there is a line in a future episode where Captain Flagg mentions to Sidney that they once played poker together, but then again, when Flagg first shows up as Flagg, Hawkeye or no Trapper remarked that, hey, didn't we see you before? So, some early installment versions that we get later on. But then again, continuity is not a match thing, so when continuity is respected, that is impressive. So like I said, it's a poke game, but there's a lot going on. Radar is going to, try to, pick up some goals, or probably one. Knowing him, he probably wouldn't get that far. But, he actually runs over a Korean Jeep, but we find out that Korean is, he's described as older than Moses, somewhere between the ages of 50 and 200, and is a professional, basically, scammer for pretending to be run over by vehicles. Of course. And that's the ending joke of the episode. He does that again. And then, of course, we have another thing. Frank is the on-duty surgeon, but he's now operating on a different CID man. I forget what CID is. It's Central Intelligence Division, maybe? I don't know. I don't remember. But regardless, he won't operate on that officer, that CID man, because it's against regulations. But Trapper and Hawkeye decide to do it anyhow because they couldn't let him die from his injuries. And that's when Flag, I'm just gonna call him Flag, even though it's not Flag, shows up and interrogates him like, yep, just agrees to do the poll game. The Flag that we actually get probably would never do that, but this is not Flag yet. It does actually make sense. And then, of course, that's really most of it. This is just a good, fun episode with everything going on. Klingo brings some food for them to eat while playing poker, but no one actually eats it until Radar takes it, which is definitely a joke they often do, where Radar being like one of the few people who actually likes to eat the army food. And then, yeah, it's, like I said, just a good, fun thing. But there's one other thing, the most serious part of this all, is that there's a patient in OR who does not want to go back to the front, but of course, Frank is just waving the flag saying he needs to do his patriotic duty and he'll be sent back to the front no matter what, and if he doesn't shut up, he gets sent back to the front sooner. Well, that soldier finds the gun and confronts Frank in the shower. And the soldier does not realize Frank really what's going on, I think, because he does not realize that, Frank's in the shower, therefore not wearing clothes, so when he notices Frank's not wearing clothes, the soldier's like, you're not wearing clothes! Like, that's something people normally do in the shower? And in some ways, it's actually kind of good that they had Sydney there, a psychiatrist. Though, Sydney trying to talk that soldier down, maybe not his best work, making Frank sound like he's a better person than Frank actually is. But that's part of the joke. But probably after Hawkeye and Trapper sneak into the tent and stops the soldier from threatening Frank, probably Sydney's going to be spending some time with that soldier, and that soldier probably isn't going back to the front now. So yeah, like I said, pretty fun episode, but the bit with the soldier, that one soldier and Frank, is the serious part of the episode to give it some actual stakes, because Hawkeye and Trapper, they always do something and break the rules, but they always get out of it. They got out of it super quickly in this episode, probably the quickest ever. Like, yep, soldier, the CID man didn't say anything, and Flag, whatever his actual name is, Halloran, I still want to call him Flag because it's the same actor. He's like, okay, good enough for me, which would not have been good enough for the Flag that we get in Flag's actual first appearance, which we got several episodes to go before that. And the CID man agrees to play poker with them, which is just hilarious. So, he does duck out before the game ends because he's not there in the morning. But yeah, like I said, good fun episode. I think I mentioned everything I want to mention, so I now want to hear from you. What did you think of Deal Me Out? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. So I'm continuing my series of Match Retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 14, Hot Lips and Empty Arms. So this is a Margaret Houlihan episode. And the episode kicks off with mail card. Everyone's getting letters, all that. And Margaret gets a letter from an old friend of hers who has a more successful life. Though, honestly, you could say Margaret actually has a truly more successful life. She volunteered as a nurse in the army. She reached the rank of major. And the army back then was pretty sexist, mind you, too. And the fact that she's, the head nurse, she has a lot going for her. in her career and all that, but the times and all that. And sounds like her friend's success is more of, her friend has married, has kids, her husband has a big home and swimming pool. Superficial stuff, especially the home and swimming pool part. But thing is, basically, Margaret gets jealous. Thinks that her life has, been rotting away. She has no social life. Actually, most people I don't think have a social life in the army, at least in the 477. Well, she doesn't because, as we see in later episodes, she doesn't really reach out to other people. Like, it's a much later episode, but the episode Nurses, where we delves into how she's built a wall between her and the nurses under her command that does not allow for any socialization. Really, the only person she really socializes with is Frank, and well, her relationship to Frank is entirely one-sided. He's just playing her. The fact that he's smart enough to play her. But yeah. So yeah, she's but she still has a good career in all things. Respectable career nowadays, definitely. Well, it depends on who you talk to, sadly. And back then, definitely, not everyone would view her military career as a woman with high esteem. But we're getting kind of off track with all that. She is angry during a session or she lashes out at everyone, the nurses, the doctors, pretty much everyone she lashes out at, but especially the nurses. And then she storms into Henry's office and requests a transfer. Of course, during her going away, she gets drunk. This is actually, I think, one of the few times, or first times, I should say, that we've seen Margaret drunk. And yeah, she gives pretty much everyone what she thinks of them. Hawkeye, Trapper, Frank, Henry. Though not Frank's. Henry probably has the nicest one where she compares him to his father, who she thinks is dead, though later on he's alive. Again, she's drunk right now, so an early continuity match. Continuity match has never really been a thing anyhow. But basically, the end, she does not leave. But then again, a lot of stuff she's complaining about, especially from Hawkeye and Chapel, are really important things. Like some stuff nowadays Hawkeye and Chapel would not be able to get away with a lot of the stuff they've done. Borderline, if not assault, definitely harassment. So yeah, so some of the stuff they do is definitely crossing a modern day line. Back then, it would have been boys will be boys, but at the same time too, it's like she's running away from her problems instead of addressing them. But at the same time, sometimes you just gotta step away from certain problems. This episode is definitely, when it comes to some of the stuff that I mentioned that she's frustrated at, is definitely a product of the times with how they deal with them. Because like I said, certain things like you should stand up, address, require an apology, but other things like sometimes you just gotta remove yourself from a situation that you find uncomfortable. And this episode of Match is definitely a product of its time where it's a lot more, the women should just deal with the boys will be boys mentality rather than actually addressing it. Though as Match matures, they move away from that stuff as well. So like I said, it's great to get a good Margaret episode. Hopefully, her characterization, because she does loosen up a little bit in this episode. Maybe she'll not be as much of a party pooper, for lack of a better term. But at the same time, we do know that she gets a much more rounded character that's just a much better character. And this episode you could see as the start of that. We gotta pay attention to future episodes. But like I said, this episode is very much of a product of its time because how certain things that Margaret is frustrated at, we would deal with very differently nowadays, or at least comment on them very differently nowadays. But that's all I got for you today. I would love to hear your thoughts on Hot Lips and Empty Arms in the comment section down below. So I'm continuing my series of Match Retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 15, Officers Only. So before we get into the episode, let's talk about members only benefits. Yes, is that an awkward transition? Definitely. But if you become a channel member for $1.99 a month, you get early access to all my videos. Now, back to the actual episode, and let's talk about what Officers Only is about. Well, so let's set up the premise. A patient has a pretty bad chest injury, so Chopper gets Hawkeye to come assist in the surgery. Well, Hawkeye actually does the surgery while Chopper assists, and Frank is, once they find out that it's a General's son, Frank wants to, participate so he can get some credit and all that. Typical Frank stuff. Anyhow, the General is very happy that they saved his son's life, so he gives Henry a case of, I believe, whiskey. He gives Hawkeye and Chapo 3-day passes to Tokyo, and they did a lot of crazy stuff in Tokyo, apparently. Lots of crazy stuff, like Henry was just getting phone call after phone call, people reporting their behavior on up to him. Yeah, crazy stuff. And then the General, he also, I believe General Mitchell, or was that his son's first name? Regardless, the General then gives them a officers club for the entire camp, which was Frank's idea. Which, honestly, Frank actually once had a good idea. An officer club is really good for the morale of the officers, not necessarily for the enlisted. And the enlisted are not that happy about it, neither are Hawkeye and Chapo, because guess who are not allowed in the old club, in the officers club? The enlisted. So basically, the enlisted basically do malicious compliance. That's the best way of describing. They're actually, snapping to your attention, saying sir at the end of every sentence. Basically, in Hawkeye and Chapo, they don't like that. They want them to cut it out. And so, they hatch a plan in order to solve the issue. So, General Mitchell's son is a private, not an officer. So, what they do is when the General comes to officially open the Officers Club, and basically they arrange so that way his son walks to the Officers Club, but he can't come in, have a drink and all that because he's enlisted. And so Hawkeye and Chapo get the General to make an exception for families of the officers. And so what does Hawkeye then do? Well, he invites the entire rest of the camp in, claiming they're all his relatives. Radar, like the son he never had. Klingo, like the daughter he never had. Cousin, brother-in-law, etc., etc., etc. Meanwhile, everyone's humming John Brown's Body, or are they humming the Battle Hymn of the Republic? It's the same tune, so it doesn't matter. I like to sing John Brown's Body because while Battle Hymn of the Republic is an amazing song and I love it, John Brown's Body feels much more soldier songs than Battle Hymn of the Republic. Both good, but that's a side tangent from the actual video. So, the purpose of this episode is really just to give them a new spot where they can hang out and tell stories. And also showing that, doing a good job can sometimes actually get you recognized by other people, by people in positions of authority. Now, the Hawkeye and Chopper probably did abuse their reward a little bit, but you know what? Frank's in his selfishness did actually get something good for the camp, and then with Hawkeye and Chopper scheming, it actually became good for the whole camp, not just the officers. But there's a few other things I do want to talk about. One, this episode really does not continue any of Margaret's character development from the last episode. Again, that really won't be a thing until Colonel Potter arrives and Frank leaves, where Margaret will truly mature as a character. But they've already laid the groundwork. And you know what? We only got about a season and a half before Colonel Potter comes. Oops, spoilers. But yeah, so that is something to be aware of. That plot line has not really continued. She's still, hanging out with Frank and all that, trying to appeal to generals. But then again, she is career army, so it makes sense in some regards. And really, we can break down Margaret's character. Now, I think for each character, I'll do a video talking about the character arc and that, and what we can infer by the character. But I'm going to wait for opportunities, such as when a character leaves, when a character arrives, or whenever I feel like it. Again, we'll wait and see on that stuff. But there's other small fun stuff going on. One of Klinger's new stunts to try to get the army is to pretend he's pregnant. But basically, his logic, so Klinger's logic, is that those think he's crazy for him, Klinger, thinking that he could convince them that he's pregnant. That's Klinger's logic, that him trying to convince them is what's going to convince them that he's crazy. Of course, no. Colonel Blake is obvious Henry. He knows that Klinger's just doing another stunt and tells no one is going to be convinced that he's pregnant. And Klingo's like, yeah, because, no sane person do what he's doing right now. Which adds another layer of actually complicated logic to it. But it's just a fun little bit there. And that also leads into when General Mitchell arrives, well, he surprised them. So Klingo's there, Henry's there, he's just wearing his skivvies, and Radar's there, and he ends up having to be behind some laundry that includes a dress at the time and all that. So it's kind of just some kind of more of a sitcom scene going on there, but it's still hilarious and gave me a good laugh. Frank trying to suck up to General Mitchell because while Frank wasn't the surgeon on duty who performed the operation, he still wants to take credit. So he said that, he was supervising the potential assistance to the surgeon who's assisting the surgeon who's performing the operation. That's how Frank justified him being a part of the operation. Which is just such a Frank thing to do. And I think that actually concludes all I have to say, but I would love to hear from you. Let me know your thoughts on this episode in the comment section down below. I'm continuing my series of Master Retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 16, Henry in Love. So the premise of this episode is that Henry's off in Tokyo and he falls in love. That's pretty much what's going on. Of course, the person he falls in love with is turning 21 that August and is less than half his age. Yeah, not a good look, Henry. Not a good look. Plus, he's married. So again, not a good look. Thankfully, the episode ends with Henry realizing the woman he truly loves is his wife. So that's good, but why do they have to, before this, write him in a relationship with nurses? Like, if he's truly in love with his wife and all that, why is he having an affair? I'm just saying. And of course, the girl he falls in love with, well, she sees Hawkeye and thinks Hawkeye's attracted to her, so she comes on to him. And again, Hawkeye's younger than Henry, but still, again, his impression he's in his late 20s, early 30s. But still, this is an episode I felt uncomfortable watching, mainly because, it's really pointing out the age gap, which I'm glad they do point it out, but they don't do enough to express that the age gap is the issue in the relationship. The issue that they present is that Henry is married and all that. Which I feel like, if they wanted to say something, maybe said that Henry's married and this person is old enough to basically be his daughter. So, yeah. Wish they had pushed that angle more. There was at least one joke about that, but that was more of a joke at Frank's expense because, they did do some contrasting with, how Frank is having an affair with Margaret, even though Frank is married back home. Not too much, mostly with Margaret mentioning that this new young lady will be old enough to be Frank's daughter. Partially because Frank was being weird in that moment, in the sense that he was trying not to be weird, so he ended up being weird in his Frank way, regardless. But I do want to say, this episode this isn't my favorite episode. It's like, if you would think it would be a good setup for some hijinks, but it's not. It's just awkward, in my opinion. They don't really address the root problem of the concept, which they could have done so easily. Like, I'm just going to bring up a later episode. I forget what episode it is, but it's after Colonel Potter has arrived, where he meets someone around his same age and falls in love, basically. And I feel like they handled that story a lot better. I think partially, one, because there was no age gap, and two, because Colonel Potter is happily married, that he values and loves his wife. You don't get that same sense from Henry, so Henry's realizing that this relationship is not going to work out because he loves his wife falls hollow because it had not been established that he values his wife, that he loves and values his wife. So there is that. But I do want to say there are some really good moments, like how it was Radar who called Henry's wife on Henry's behalf, which I think was a good thing. Radar identified the need, and apparently Henry had not been responding to his wife Lorraine's letter, so that was good. This was just kind of more of a fun, sad gag, but since Henry was in Tokyo, Frank was briefly, acting CEO. He calls himself Supreme Commander. One, he's not, he's just the acting CEO as being the executive officer. He becomes the acting CEO when the CEO is not there. And two, he had the rocks painted red, white, and blue. I had never noticed that before in this episode, but they never pointed it out, but the rocks in the background are red, white, and blue. And we know in previous episodes he's tried to get the rocks painted white. So apparently this time he succeeded, and Margaret didn't point out the airway problems of painting rocks red, white, and blue. But that's all I got to say on this episode. I know there's not much to say, but for an episode I thought was awkward, I feel like they didn't do the premise properly or actually address the problems of the concept itself, which I guess you could say is definitely a product of its time. We probably would be addressing the storyline differently nowadays if we kept the premises the same, just changed how we would address certain things because of new sensibilities, updating, changing sensibilities, all that. But you know what? I would love to hear your thoughts on the episode Henry in Love in the comment section down below. I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 17, For Want of a Boot. So, for the premise of this episode, Hawkeye has a hole in his boot, much like I got a hole in my slipper. So, the entire episode is because he's trying to get a new pair of boots. Well, first he puts Frank's birthday card in his boot to try to plug the hole. Frank does get it back. But it goes on a bunch of things. He goes to the supply sergeant, so this is our first appearance as Sergeant Zale, and Zale agrees to expedite Hawkeye's boots if he can get Zale an appointment with the dentist. The dentist will agree to see Zale if Hawkeye can get Henry to give the dentist a 3-day pass to Tokyo. Henry will agree to give the dentist a 3-day pass to Tokyo if Hawkeye will get Margaret to not send the report that she's preparing on Colonel Blake, on Henry, up to one of the generals, and then she'll agree not to do that if Hawkeye arranges a birthday party for Frank, and then in order to get a cake for the party, because then they don't trust the cook, Hawkeye will have to set Radar up on a date with Nurse Murphy, and Nurse Murphy will agree to go on a date with Radar if Hawkeye can arrange a hairdryer, and Klinger will allow the use of his hairdryer for this if Hawkeye and Chapel can get Frank to sign off on discharge papers, basically Section 8 papers, to get him out of the army. Yeah, it's one of those episodes, wheeling and dealing. I think they've done one or two other episodes like this total. I don't remember exactly, but it all falls apart. Frank does not want to let Klinger out of the army, calling him a pervert. I'm just saying, and Hawkeye brings this up, gee, just keep all the perverts in the army, or something along those lines. Yeah, if Frank and Margaret think Klinger is crazy, they don't think he should be wearing women's clothes, they think he should be out of the army. So why don't they sign? Easy, because Hawkeye asked them to. I legitimately think that's the reason why, because Hawkeye asked them. I don't know, but that's where it starts to fall apart. Klinger retrieves his hairdryer, the date is called off, so Radar takes the cake away, the party falls apart, so Margaret decides that she's going to add all this to her report to the general. Henry tears up the 3-day pass, the dentist is not going to see Zale, and Zale won't expedite Hawkeye's boots. And Hawkeye did this all for the want of a boot. Just one boot, not 2 boots, 1 boot. Just like my slippers, I got one fine and my other one has the hole in it. So, all that goes on. And what does Hawkeye do in the end? Well, he replaced his boot with a golf club bag at the very end. It's hilarious, but really this episode is just a bunch of, basically, I'll scratch your back, you scratch my back, a bunch of quid pro quos in order to get stuff done. And of course it falls apart because they eventually get to a point where there's no agreement to be made and it falls apart. So like I said, fun, enjoyable episode, not much going on. But you know what? Wearing a golf bag because it's wintertime, I'm pretty sure the rest of his leg is actually a bit warmer than his other leg, so positive. Anyhow, I would love to hear your thoughts on this episode in the comment section down below. I'm continuing my series of MASH Retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 19, Operation Noselift. So, the premise of this episode is that there's a private at the camp who is very insecure about his nose. He believes it's too big and he goes AWOL. He's constantly looking for a hospital or someplace that will perform a nose job, so perform plastic surgery. So that way he will feel more comfortable with it. So, Hawkeye has a friend from back in residency who's currently a major in Tokyo who performs plastic surgery. He gets him to come to the 477 to perform the surgery. Of course, he does trick by saying there's a nurse with a nickname the Barracuda, because this plastic surgeon, who is basically, he has a very high libido, let's put it that way. And weirdly enough, this character is played by an actor who appeared in another episode, and there's some unsettling, uncomfortable similarities with that character. Both characters put themselves on Margaret despite she rejecting the advances. And it's just really uncomfortable and all that. I really wish there was a different way or all that. And literally, it's just a very uncomfortable scene where the plastic surgeon does, try to push himself on Margaret despite her clearly not wanting it. And yeah, remember, kids, a yes is a yes, a no is a no, and anything that isn't definitively a accepting of consent is a no. Just remember that. So, yeah, that's the biggest problem with this episode. The fact that this plastic surgeon is, willing to, put himself out there and not really listen to a nurse when she says no. And he faces no consequences for it. This is a common thing in the early seasons of MASH, especially where, the nurses are just more props in terms of the storytelling for the guys rather than anything else. Very common. I really wish they would have, treated the nurses more as actual characters. They've done that a little bit with Margaret, but it's really not until later seasons where they start really treating the nurses as characters in their own right. But unfortunately, that's not this episode. But the good thing is the soldier, he does get his nose job so that way he can feel more comfortable in his own body. Is that anything like gender from Kale? Just saying. Not quite, because they're not really reaffirming his own gender, but they are basically making him more comfortable in his own body in the way that it's not going to be impacting his mental health or his morale. So now maybe he can actually do his job because he's not distracted with his own insecurities regarding his nose. So that's actually a really good message when you think about it. But everything with the plastic surgeon and his behavior, nope, not at all. I'm not a big fan of. But I did kind of like the scene after where Hawkeye gets him to actually finally go to perform the surgery, where Chopper comforts Margaret. Now, he does put on a fake Southern accent, but it's actually showing that Hawkeye and Chopper do care about Margaret to a little degree. I do feel like they get better at that stuff once they get BJ involved and Chopper's gone, but Chopper does comfort Margaret, and Margaret does accept the comfort. It's, platonic comfort, but it's when Margaret needed that moment. But that's the only good thing about the scene, is showing that, Chopper giving Margaret, the opportunity to, de-stress, to, feel some comfort in a more safe, which is weird saying that about Chopper because, he is a serial adult after all, but at least that part of it is okay-ish. But again, I'm not really comfortable with that entire plot point. But what's actually funny? The fact that Henry just does not want to know what's going on at all regarding the plastic surgery being performed. And yeah, it's like, he tells Radar to make a note that he wasn't there today. And of course, no, when Radar asks who should sign it and all that, he says, "You sign it in my name, and then that way I can say it's a forgery." It's like just craziness. That stuff with Henry and Radar, that was funny. That was good. When Frank comes in again to speak with Henry, again, that was a funny scene because Frank is doesn't know why he's there. Henry didn't actually call for him, and Henry's like, "I'm not here, I'm not there," kind of deal. It's just funny. And of course, I do want to real quick mention the beginning of the episode where where Henry is where Henry is dictating a letter to Radar, and you think it might be a reference to the report that Margaret would have sent after the end of the last episode because of the way it opened, but it's about a totally different thing that both Frank and Margaret are reporting Henry for. But it's like they could have so easily built off of last week's episode, but they didn't, and that's frustrating. But continuity is not a thing in Early Match. It's barely a thing in the later episodes when they get a little bit better about it, but that's alright. But it would have been a neat connection that could have shown a through line, but they didn't. They chose to make up a new scenario instead. But on that topic, there is actually one other line that Frank said where he mentioned that this entire thing going on with the plastic surgeon and performing a Noselift illegally because it's not allowed in a combat zone, that he'll include that in his weekly anonymous report to the general. Frank, it's not anonymous if everyone knows it's coming from you. But that's Frank. So, like I said, there's some good stuff in this episode, but some really uncomfortable stuff that I wish they could have played a little bit better, but it's weirdly a product of its time, both the time when the show was made and the time when the show was set. But I do wish they had done it slightly differently to have more pushback on the uncomfortable parts of the episode, and they really didn't do that. They really kind of failed to do that in a lot of regards. But that's the way it is, and I want to hear your thoughts on the episode Operation Noselift in the comment section down below. I'm continuing my series of Master Retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 19, The Chosen People. So the premise of this episode is that a family of Korean refugees arrives at the 477 and is claiming it's their land. Meanwhile, a young Korean lady from the nearby village shows up at camp claiming that one of the doctors is the father of her child. So, Henry has to deal with both. I should also mention that during this episode they have the return of Captain Park. He's visiting the 407. This time he's not playing poker alongside Sidney Friedman, but hey, he's visiting, and he speaks Korean because he's Korean, therefore he can translate. That's probably the main reason why, because they want a more effective translation. And actually, they opened up the episode in OR with him observing and basically giving some humorous translations based off of what Hawkeye is saying. Which apparently Hawkeye can somewhat speak. Now, if any actual Korean speakers are watching, and you want to watch this episode and tell me how accurate those translations are, let me know, because it's MASH. There's been some episodes where they have very abysmal Korean, so wouldn't surprise me at all. But the jokes are that basically they're just having fun with some humorous translations. But I do want to just take a side note and talk about Frank, because he does play a role in this episode with his basically gung-ho American attitude. Basically in the OR, he's complaining that they're talking about Korean to English translations, and he says, "I speak American." And you know what? That fits in Frank's character so perfectly. He's that person who goes to a foreign country expecting them to speak American. Not English, American. He does fit that characterization, and that stereotype has unfortunately continued to this day, and we really need to put the kibosh on it. But he talks about how he shops at an American PX. They have a PX on at the 477? I didn't realize that. But the point being is that Frank is very gung-ho, pro-American, very narrow-minded, and that's very much his characterization as a whole. But this does come into play because Henry contacts Savannah first to try to get their help with dealing with this Korean refugee family, because that's their job. Henry's job is to run a hospital, not run a refugee resettlement camp / center. it's not his job, so he contacts the people whose job it is, and he's not getting any role. Well, because he's sick of basically Frank making things worse, he tells Frank, you go contact the civilian affairs officer. And Frank actually does get some role. He might have almost actually gotten himself a date, too. And Frank acts all offended, but they do sometimes play Frank more effeminate and imply that he could be gay or homosexual, but of course, in other episodes they make it clear that he's not, but he's played that way, which goes into some of the stereotypes of, the gay villain who's an effeminate man. Again, they're playing up that stuff. This has been a part of Frank's characterization for a while, but I could definitely see Frank being the kind of person who overcompensates to overcome any internal insecurities he may have. But that's enough about Frank's characterization. He does get he actually somehow manages to help the Korean family by getting in contact with the right person to push the right buttons to get something done. So Frank's not totally useless, just incompetent and insensitive. Yeah, that's Frank. And then, of course, with the other plotline, the Korean lady from the village claims one of the doctors is the mother of her child, so Henry assumes it's either Hawkeye or Chapel. Obviously, he knows it's not himself, and he figures it wouldn't be Frank, but there's supposed to be another shift, so that means there's at least, I would say, 2, if not 3 or 4 more doctors. There's also a dentist. They got other candidates. Yeah. Sometimes they forget they have other doctors for the sake of plot. Very common in MASH, which makes sense. They don't need a whole team because it's an ensemble, so why do they need extra characters? That would just be confusing. I wouldn't mind it personally, but hey, it's what it is. Anyhow, Hawkeye and Chapel come in, and they're not the father. Raider comes in, and the young Korean lady's like, he's the father. And I'm just going to cut to the chase. They contact the Judge Advocate General to get this straightened out, and Raider actually does go fond of the baby. It's not his. As he says, he's never done it. Though, season 1 Raider might have. You can definitely tell they are doing much more with the naive Radar character. Because in some episodes, especially in season 1, they were still toying with his character, and his movie characterization was a bit more common, where he was not as naive. So, movie Radar could do that. That would make sense, but not TV show Radar as we come to know and love. So, like I said, he does go to Fond. Now, Hawkeye and Chopper do perform a blood test at Frank's suggestion, no less. Now, I don't know if they had thought of that, or Frank had actually given them the idea, but they wouldn't go admit that Frank gave them the idea, because they basically like, good job, Frank, for pointing out the obvious. And then they go do a blood test. I wonder if they didn't think of it until Frank pointed it out. Again, Frank's not totally useless, just insensitive and mean. And whatever word I used earlier. So they do that, and the blood test comes back, shows that Raider is not the father. Now, I do want to just take a side tangent, to state that in just some research preparing for my review, that blood tests were back then the only way, besides both parties being truthful, to determine parentage. And it wasn't a foolproof method because, blood is not as unique as DNA testing that we do now. But still, it could at least tell somebody they were not the father for sure. It just couldn't give a definitive that the person is the father. So, Raider's clearly not the father with his blood type. It just will not work out. But he decides he's going to claim anyhow. I think partially because he grew fond of the baby. And that's kind of within Raider's characterization. He's always caring about animals. Anytime there's a baby that comes into the 477, he's like, oftentimes, if I recall, the character who often comes the closest, always very caring. It's a very common thing with Raider's character, so that's definitely present in this episode. Of course, he can't be the father at all, so granted, I guess there's nothing that's stopping him from still stepping in as a stepfather, but the point being is that in the eyes of the army, this thing is settled. And because the father was actually a GI who knows, dead, transferred home, we don't know, they don't know. They're able to bring both plots together to a resolution. So Through Frank contacting civilian affairs, the refugees get relocated someplace further south, which also means they're safer from the fighting. And also, so the young Korean lady whose name I should have wrote down so I could remember, and her baby, they join with that family to head down. So while she may have lost her family due to shunning, she at least has a new family now that can help raise her daughter. I believe it was a daughter. So, really good episode. I really love how it highlighted the differences between the characters, and it has some pretty good humor. I already mentioned basically just the fun, stupid translation that they were doing in the opening, which the intention was that they're going to be kind of nonsensical and get more nonsensical as they go on within the narrative. I still want to hear from any people who do speak Korean how good that Korean and those translations actually are, because I am curious. I probably could have done more research, but you know what? Engagement bait. Let me know in the comment section down below. And there's a few other good jokes too, like the making fun of Frank, which again, this episode really is a good highlight of Frank's character, despite him not being a major character. It shows that he's not totally incompetent. He does have some strengths. Unfortunately, he's insensitive and a jerk, and nobody likes him. So he can't overcome his flaws because he's an insensitive jerk who has no intention of ever growing up or growing as a character or growing as a person. He has no intention, but still, a good highlight of Frank's character is showing that beneath all his problems, he does have some redeeming qualities. Unfortunately, he doesn't let them resurface enough. And from what I've heard, Larry Linville was the total opposite of Frank, so I think these moments of humanity out of Frank was more Larry just poking out through his character. That's just my speculation. There's also another joke I would really love to mention is when a representative of the Judge Advocate General comes in. First Henry thought he was from Civilian Affairs. No, he's from the JAG office, and actually I should say the Judge Advocate office. But regardless, because Henry's there along with Captain Pack and Father McKay introduces both of them. He says ROK for Captain Pack, which I think is truthful because one, ROK is the English initialism of the Republic of Korea, but it's also okay, like okay, like okie dokie. I think that was kind of like a subtle pun they did though. Took me a while to get that from when I very first watched it because I just knew South Korea, not the Republic of Korea. I'm talking about when I was in middle school, by the way. And then, of course, introduces Father McKay, and instead of saying USA or anything like that, he says God, God, because Father McKay is a priest. It's just a fun little bit there, and I thought it was it was a good chuckle out of me. But that concludes my review. I probably have more to say. You guys have more to say, I'm sure, as well. The comment section down below is open for discussion, so I would love to hear your thoughts. I'm continuing my series of Mash Retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 20, As You Were. So, what's going on at the 477 this episode? Well, there's a lull. They have no characters and all that, so they're just doing stuff to, entertain themselves, try to not be bored. So, Henry is using some surgical trays and improvising for sunbathing. Father McKay is washing his own feet. Klinger's coming up with another scheme to try to get discharged for psychological reasons. Frank is lining up all the condiments in the mess tent to the perfect level. Hawkeye and Trapper, well, let's see. They're watching Frank do that. They're playing cards, and then they get some gorilla suits delivered, so they play cards wearing gorilla suits. But then we also then find out there's a scene that we learn that Frank has a hernia and might need, it to be, operated on. So Margaret convinces him to go ask Trapper and Hawkeye to perform the operation. Margaret was the one that was really pushing for that. One, she actually does, I think, respect Trapper and Hawkeye's skills as a doctor. She may not always approve of their behavior, but she recognizes that they are competent and skilled medical professionals. Notice how when Frank pushed her on his own skills, she avoided. She knows that Frank is not the most skilled doctor on base. She knows that. She doesn't tell him, but she knows that. Anyhow, so yes, they go into the swamp, and Margaret's, probably does, I think, most of the talking, but there to support Frank, which is actually good. Shows a more positive side of their relationship that we normally don't get to see. And, well, Hawkeye and Trapper are still wearing their gorilla suits, so make that Frank is aghast. Margaret's not pleased with that, but, she still encourages Frank to go through asking Hawkeye and Trapper to perform the honey operation. They do agree. They mess around a little bit, but they do agree. And they're ready to start. They scrubbed up, and casualties are coming in. So, Frank, you gotta wait. So they do that, but in the middle of surgery, Frank gets an attack of his hernia, and he's sent to post-op. They elevate his feet and sedate him for the time being. So they're down a surgeon now, but that doesn't really impact the episode. But in other episodes, that would be a major part of the story, but it isn't in this episode. Instead, a more major part of the story, and it's still quite minor, is that they're low on whole blood, so Father McKay arranges blood donations from the camp. And so there's that. But again, not much is going on story-wise. This is a slice of life episode. That's what this episode is all about. We might call it filler nowadays, but the true term for any kind of thing that doesn't have a major character arc or a major plot development is slice of life. No, we don't learn anything majorly new. We just get to see the characters be themselves. We get to know them a little better, but not in a fundamental, profound way. Just normal slice of life. And that's what this episode is about. Of course, there's a little more to the episode. It does come to a point Frank's hernia has to be operated on, so he's prepped for surgery, and at the same time, a Korean woman comes in who's pregnant and is about to give birth, so they also bring her into the operating room as well. And of course, the joke is that the birth happens at the same time that Frank's hernia is removed, so Hawkeye jokes that Frank and Margaret gave birth to a 5-pound hernia. That's I think ultimately where the jokes were leading toward in this episode. Again, it's a slice of life episode. Nothing major happens, but there's just small moments here and there that we can appreciate. We get to learn a little bit more about each of the different characters. Like, for example, this proves that Klinger is faking his attempts to get out of the army on being crazy. Who writes a letter to a general saying that, see this picture of me in a dress? This proves that I'm crazy, therefore I should not be in the army. If you have that sound of a reasoning, you're not crazy. And that's Klinger's whole shtick. He's not crazy, but he's doing what people believe to be crazy and telling them that he's crazy. Does that make sense? He's trying to play the game, but he's playing it so well you can identify that he's just playing the game to try to get out on being crazy. So there's that. But there's other small things too. This episode I think might be the first ones where we get a lot of scenes with Father McKay telling jokes. I'm sure it's happened before, but this one has probably the most amount. There's also the recurring bit of, I think it might be the first time we see, but Henry trying to actually give his annual or his monthly lecture on VD. Well, guess what? He fails. Of course he fails. He's uncomfortable with that. Notice how they never did that plot point with Conaparto. And that's probably because it wouldn't have been funny, because he would have just given the talk and the lecture and it would have been over. But with Frank, they could play it up for laughs. But again, everything about this episode is just really more slice of life stuff, just to, give us a better introduction or better feel of our characters. We've seen them already for over 40 episodes now. Makes sense. Reinforce who these characters are for us. Give us a better insight into who they are as people and just what they do normally. Not anything crazy or that. Though I will say this, if Frank had a hernia, it was bothering him for over 10 years before it became bad, how is he in the army? I feel like that would have disqualified him, but I don't know what the things are about hernias way back during the Korean War and how that affects one's ability to be in the military. I don't even know how that affects people today in the military, so yeah. But I do feel like that's the only inconsistency with this episode. But that's pretty much all I got to say. Like I said, one minor inconsistency, and while the episode may be boring, it's supposed to be a boring slice of life episode, but it's not really that boring when you really think about it. It's only boring if you believe that nothing major, nothing character changing or plot changing or anything that goes on is boring. It's interesting because it's slice of life. And that's where I'm going to end my review today. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. I'm continuing my series of Masterette reviews with Season 2, Episode 21, Crisis. So in this episode, it's cold and they are not going to be getting supplies for quite some time. The lines have been cut off. The supply lines have been intercepted. So, yeah. They're in bit of a crisis mode, so they have to ration heat, power, food, pretty much everything, including shuttlecocks. So for badminton, that is clearly a joke, but that means they're not getting recreational supplies as well that will keep up morale. So yes, things are actually decent-ish because they had warning, so they were able to adapt. So, they combine sleeping quarters together to save on heating costs. Electrical usage is severely limited. Pretty much the only restrictions they're not really doing is stuff related to, running the hospital. So, patients and all that, they get priority for food, supplies, everything like that. Surgeries, though, they still are trying to, make sure they don't overextend those supplies, especially for things like blood, which is a more limited quantity. So given how often they take donations from the camp, at least, I don't know how quickly that blood could actually be used, but in the universe of MASH, that is something they do frequently, though they didn't mention in this episode, but they do adapt. So it's kind of funny watching them all, try to share quotas together and just, I don't know. The first night they don't get any sleep because wounded come in, and the second night, who knows if they actually get any sleep? Probably no, because, Frank had heated socks, so he had to charge that battery somehow. He also, as the person in charge of rationing food, he took a baked ham to share with Margaret. Well, Hawkeye and Chopper catch him, and they take it. Knowing them, well, they probably did eat it. They probably shared it with most of the camp, knowing them. So Frank, to his credit, says, Margaret was entirely innocent of stealing the ham from the supply. Which, again, showing that there is some compassion in Frank. The past couple episodes have been showing that despite Frank being, a jerk and unable to truly be a good human being, he does have those qualities hidden inside of him. He just normally, and most of the time, does not know how to act on them, which is fitting for his character. And I'm speculating in a previous review, but if those more softer sides were more Larry Linville coming out rather than any actual sincerity in Frank's character. I'm just wondering in that regard. But yeah. Really good episode, fun, some great jokes. They have a couple of scenes where they keep on cutting back to Henry's office. Well, technically only 2 cutbacks, but each time 3 times, yeah. So first we see his office as normal. Next time, well, his desk is missing its legs and a few drawers. Next time we cut back, it's just top of the desk. That's the image I used in my thumbnail. And then lastly, well, the skeleton is still there. He's sitting on the box and he has his phone. Everything else in his office is gone. Because they were grabbing anything they can to burn, Notice that, like, willing to go on a date with somebody who provides them with 5 pieces of firewood. Like, all that crazy stuff. Toilet paper is one of the things that they're most limited on. There's a line where they say that, people are getting into the fortune cookies. Not to eat, no. So they can use their fortunes as toilet paper. That's really small toilet paper. But the point being is that that's the thing they're probably going through the most. It's easy enough to ration firewood and electricity. That stuff is easier to ration. In electricity case, it would be the fuel for the generators. But so they can ration that stuff fairly effectively, fairly simply. But toilet paper, well, you gotta go, and you gotta clean. So, yeah, you can see why that was probably the thing that they saw the most pinching of in terms of rationing, in terms of struggles. And then at the end of the episode, they get those supplies at the end. We don't see that, but they're told. So that's good. That is good. Though I know in some previous episodes they were getting supplies and they get the wrong supplies. Don't think that's the case here because in the last scene with Henry in his now empty office, he thanks them for supplies, but he's like, yeah, about my office, they burned everything that wasn't nailed down or salute. So he needs his office refurnished. But that's pretty much where I'm going to end my review. Again, not too much major stuff going on, just some nice, great, fun moments with our characters. And that's pretty much it. We get to see a little bit of that softer side, and Frank, he's still Frank, of course, but it's nice when those softer sides come up. Reminds us how, he is, a person. Granted, he's incapable of change, and that's the key of Frank's characterization. He's incapable of change, which does make him a good contrast to Hawkeye, Trapper, and the rest of the camp, a good antagonist for them, but not necessarily a foil. And that's where Charles will come in once we get there. But we got a couple more seasons to go before we get to there. So let me know your thoughts on this episode in the comment section down below. So I'm continuing my series of Master Retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 22, George. So to begin with, this episode is probably one of the most progressive episodes of MASH. It tackles a subject that in the 1970s was still largely taboo, as I understand it, and a subject that definitely was taboo in the 1950s. Now, before I continue, because of my own life experience, I'm not the best person to talk about this. So I'm going to be linking in the cards and in the description a video from the channel Matt Baum. I hope I pronounced that right. I apologize if I did. That talks about this episode way better than I ever could. So let's go really discuss what this episode is about. So the titular character George, he comes into the camp, in combat evac and all that. And besides his combat wounds, he also has lots of other bruises that came from members of his own unit. He decides he can trust Hawkeye and tells him that there's been 2 people in his unit that were beat up, a colored person and a homosexual. Hawkeye's response, so you're a Negro. That is a very deliberate language on Hawkeye's part, and also on George Weston, that his last name's his part as well. Neither of them can outright say it, but they both understand. I should mention, George's skin color is my skin color, white. He's not a black American. And if you are picking up on what I'm saying, you are picking up on what the episode is saying. Nowadays, we have no problems saying that someone is, well, we generally don't use the term homosexual anymore in society. We use the term gay or lesbian for women. We typically use that. Some people will use slurs too. I bet Frank would. Because Frank's story in this is he wants to get George dishonorably discharged for that. Hawkeye and Trapper oppose it, so they basically fake fight and get Frank to reveal that he paid for test answers for a medical exam, and they use that to blackmail him to destroy his report and not send it up the chain of command. I should also mention, this episode also has an example of a character who supports the policy of don't ask, don't tell. That's Henry. When Frank goes to Henry about this, Henry's response is, has he made a pass at you or anyone? And no, George hadn't. I think George values consent. So Henry definitely takes a position of that don't ask, don't tell, since nobody's been asked, and as far as Henry knows, George never told anyone. It's just gossip. Henry does not care. He thinks it's a frivolous endeavor. Now, how would he have responded if George had made a pass at someone? I don't know. Henry's presented as the more moderate character that is paying attention to the actions rather than the words in this situation. Well, Hawkeye and Trapper, even if George had asked somebody out, they wouldn't have cared. Actually, Hawkeye might have been flattered too, depending on how you view his character. And lots of people debate if Hawkeye is, a standard heterosexual or bi. There's a lot of debate that I've discovered among certain groups in the fandom. really, I'm learning a lot about MASH by doing these reviews. And that's actually what I really want to transition to talking about in this video. Though before I do that, I do want to mention one other thing. Apparently, originally when they made this episode, the writers were initially intending to have Frank reveal. I got this off the MASH wiki, by the way. It is linked to a source, so hopefully it's accurate. So apparently the wiki mentioned that original intention of the writers was to have Frank admit that he once had an attraction to another man, but the network shot it down. And I actually kind of agree with the network on that. The network probably didn't want to show one of its main characters being gay. However, I think it's better because they already, a lot with Frank, use the feminized villain trope, and if they made Frank have that revelation, that would have almost undermined the message that they were trying to tell. So I actually agree with the network, but probably for a different reason, because I'm looking at it as what they're trying to say. Now, I don't mind Frank being a hypocrite. In fact, there's a joke from the Hawkeye chapter that the reason why Frank requested not to have George on his rounds anymore was because, he got excited every time. That wasn't intended as a joke, and it could be true. They do portray Frank more feminine than a lot of the other male characters on MASH. But again, I'm glad that they changed the blackmail to blackmailing him as, for medical fraud or medical exam fraud rather than something else, because that would have seemed out of character for Hawkeye and Chopper based off of what they were doing in this episode and just some other stuff as well. But going back to what this episode has taught me about MASH and this experience of doing retro reviews as a whole. To begin with, there's generally considered to be 2 or 3 eras of MASH. We have the seasons 1 through 3 with Henry Blake, and then we have the rest of the show with Colonel Potter, but you can also divide with Frank and without Frank. That those middle episodes with both Frank and Potter can be viewed as their own separate era from the other two, depending on how you view it. But most MASH fans prefer the later seasons once we get Potter. And one is, I think we got stronger characters, but another thing is we get more hard-hitting episodes like this one. We get more episodes that challenge our perception, that make us think about things that we may not have had thought before because of our own life experiences. I live a pretty safe suburban lifestyle in America. I have not had to deal with persecution for anything like that. So those things in here that I wouldn't relate to, but it can make me think. And this episode is really the highs of the early season. I've said this in a couple other videos, but the inklings of what MASH will become are in this episode, but there's a lot more other episodes. This is definitely one of the episodes. Another one is Sometimes You Hear the Bird, where I think the word I'm looking for is where what MASH has become, or what MASH will become, becomes way more forefront in a part of the episodes. But many a times, what MASH will become is hidden in a line of dialogue, is hidden in one scene and just doesn't get explored. And this episode shows that really, and same thing with Sometimes You Hear the Bird, that what MASH will become, the seeds were always there to begin with. It was only as new writers came in and as new characters joined, replacing old characters, that those seeds bore fruit and became the MASH that we know. Granted, some people do prefer the more crass earlier seasons, but as shown by this episode, the early seasons aren't at all crass, and I've gained through this entire process, not just this episode, a new appreciation for the early episodes, the early seasons of MASH. An appreciation I don't think I had before. Granted, I'm just waiting for season 3. I think it's episode 12. I got some thoughts about that episode, but that's a very different episode. We're going to be getting there in time, and hopefully I get the right one in my head. There are some other things we could address, small moments here and there, but I think I've said most of what I wanted to say about this episode. So if you have any insights, any thoughts you would like to leave, let me know them in the comment section down below. I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with Season 2, Episode 23, Mail Call. So this is apparently the first episode directed by Alan Alda, so I just wanted to throw that out there. But let's actually talk about the episode. It's Mail Call, and everyone gets some sort of mail, and we get to see their reactions to it. So Henry gets basically a bunch of, payments and check stubs from his wife, and he's expected to, balance her checkbook. Now, I do want to say he's mad about this episode, but if you remember a couple episodes back, he says to send them to her. Granted, a lot has gone on since then. I forgot about that, so yeah. Hawkeye, I get to that too. And does he get that from his father? Well, he gets a sweater from his sister that by the end of next season will no longer have existed. Yeah, early continuity of MASH is not always accurate. Continuity is not a big thing in shows this time period anyhow, but apparently, according to the wiki, I gotta pay attention, but the sweater does show up after they establish that he doesn't have a sister. Frank gets, a letter from his stockbrokers, and so Hawkeye and Trapper, mostly Hawkeye, but they hatch a plan to make Frank look foolish by getting him to invest in a fictitious company called Pioneer Aviation. Yeah, in all honesty, Frank, gotta try to think things through a little bit, especially if it's coming from Hawkeye, somebody you don't trust. I'm just saying. Also, too, that Hawkeye basically, well, when he made Pioneer Aviation up, he basically said that his congressperson was doing insider trading. So I'm just saying that, since he made Pioneer Aviation up, his congressperson wasn't doing that, but he implied his congressperson would do it. Trapper gets a letter from his wife, including pictures of his kids, and that leads to him getting depressed and homesick, and he tries to head back home. Hawkeye stops him. Also helps that, they reveal to Frank that they made Pioneer Aviation up. That helps a lot, too. Who else got a letter? I don't remember if Margaret got anything. Oh, I should mention, Klinger, of course, fakes getting a letter. He might have gotten a real letter from his family, I don't know, but this is probably one of the best known scenes from this episode where goes to Kuna Blake's office and is like, reveals that his father's in a coma and needs to get a hardship discharge and sent home. And then Henry pulls out basically all those hardship stuff he did. Sister dying, sister pregnant, mother dying, mother pregnant, half the family dying, half the family pregnant, all that stuff. This is the episode that scene comes from. I should also mention when Radar gets the mail, the camp swamps him and apparently somehow they take the outer layers of his uniform at the same time. So yeah. There's also another thing too is I had mentioned the past couple of you that some of these softer, nicer sides of Frank were shown that would kind of explain why besides being a authority figure, why Margaret would be interested in him. This episode undoes all that. Again, Frank is never really a good person. He's a jerk, self-centered, all that time. But here, he thinks he's struck gold in the stock market and all that, and he's probably right that his wife would take half of the things if he divorced his wife in favor of Margaret. But the thing is, this episode shows how Frank is truly just playing Margaret. And the fact that, yes, they have a brief breakup, but the fact that by the end of the episode, they get back together, that Frank promises that basically he'll do whatever she wants, i.e. satisfy her and however she wants, and that's all it takes to get them back together. It's like, Margaret, you can do so much better than Frank. And that's actually one of the biggest problems with the early seasons of MASH. The fact that Margaret is not really allowed to advance as a character. There was that one episode, I forget the name of it, where her character did advance, but the status quo was reset in the very next episode. Now, once Kuna Party comes in, she actually has an authority figure that she can respect and does not need a romantic relationship with, more of a fatherly relationship. And then meeting Kuna Penobscot in Japan was what allowed Margaret to break free of Frank, and really that's when her character started advancing. But this episode shows that the writers are almost too stuck keeping Frank and Margaret together, even though Margaret does not deserve Frank. That's actually really all I got to say. There's not too much going on. It's just a bunch of fun vignettes, but there was that character stuff I really wanted to mention. Some of the classic comedic scenes as well. Is there more stuff? Yes. But that is what the comment section is for, so let me know your thoughts down there, and have a good rest of your day. I'm continuing my series of MASH retro reviews with the 24th and final episode of Season 2, The episode is A Smattering of Intelligence. And the most intelligent characters in this episode aren't the people from intelligence. No, they're crazy. Maybe intelligently crazy, but still crazy. So, this is another Corner Flag episode. He comes in because, his first appearance in this episode, he wasn't Corner Flag. But, come on. They just decided to hit the reset button and now have the characters remember him. But it's pretty much Corner Flag in that previous episode, which I talked about. But anyhow, this is Corner Flag's first proper appearance. He comes in from a helicopter crash, and that's how he gets in the camp. And he's looking for something. Well, we don't know what it is, but we do know that one of Trapper's old friends, a Vinnie Pratt, if I remember correctly. Yeah, lots of fake names in this episode, by the way. Comes in, so we at least can trust his at least identity, maybe not his job, but his identity, because Trapper knows him. But he comes in saying that he's from G2 and he's here to figure out what Corner Flag is up to because of, G2 wants its money and Flag's, is it CIA, CIC, or CID? It's CIA. And, what they're up to because we need to make sure we get the money and they don't. By the way, G2's intelligence on a divisional level, I'm just saying, so technically he probably actually would be with, he probably would be with maybe CIC, which would be Army Counterintelligence. CID is Army Criminal Investigation Division. CIA is the Central Intelligence Agency. Kind of Army, kind of not, at this time in history, if I remember correctly. Regardless, bunch of fake names for both of these characters go around, but Flag keeps on changing which C organization he's from. Pratt, he sticks with G2, and his cover, he's an engineer. But essentially, both of these characters are trying to find something. So what does Hawkeye and Trapper do? They decide to basically frame Frank and plant false intelligence in his file. So yes, they convince Flag that Frank is a communist by, the fact that he gave money to supposedly communist-backed charities. And Frank's response is he believes everyone has a right to be poor. Man, that reminds me of, rich people today. Frank, I don't like you. Honestly, seems like that proves why Frank is just a mean-spirited jerk of a character, unlike his actor. But meanwhile, for Pratt, they convince him that Frank is a fascist instead. And I actually, if you look at what the fake stuff in his file, the fake fascist stuff is actually way more damning than the fake communist stuff. Fake communist stuff. He donates to charity and in Tokyo visited the Russian ballet. None of those are that incriminating unless you die hard on finding communists in a red scale. Meanwhile, with the fake fascist evidence, it's more damning. Involved with the German American Bund, the KKK. Like, that's more damning stuff than actual terrorist organizations and subversive elements. Again, there could be my left-leaning bias affecting that, but donating charity and seeing ballet, it's not incriminating. It's not like he gave nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. That would be incriminating. But the point is that both of these characters are so set on finding something that they don't question what they're reading. Especially Flag, because he was told by Frank to take a look at his file. If Frank saw what he had in there was incriminating, he wouldn't have done that. And with Pratt, it was more of, just, I think, I think with that, Hawkeye and Trapper, yeah, they want to put one over on Pratt, especially with Trapper being an old friend, but putting one on Frank, and that's kind of what they think of Frank. They think that he's a right-leaning nut, a ultra-nationalist. We know how Frank would be voting today. He would be voting based off of blind loyalty to nationalism rather than, anything more sensible. All that to say, this is a really good episode. It's fun. And that's what this episode is all about, having fun. There's many great comedic moments. And there's one other thing I want to mention before I end my review. I could talk about every comedic moment, but that would take forever, such as Flag deliberately making his injury worse so he will have a medical reason to remain at the 477. That's a good joke. There's many others, including with Flag's fake identities, including one that Henry should not use in his records because he's going to need that in the week in Tokyo. Like, just a bunch of fun jokes. But the episode ends with a joint report from both of them, because they know each other. They're both in intelligence, of course. So, and I think, and also because Pratt takes pictures of the swan right before he leaves, it's confirming that he did not tell the whole truth why he was there, I think. Again, we're both a little crazy, but Pratt at least the most sensible, at least the most sensible in how he goes about things. But anyhow, I didn't catch this when I first watched this episode, but the ending with the report, a picture of each of our main characters, it's literally just the same thing they've done at the end of the other episode, just recapping who our characters are at the end of the season in a fun way. I didn't catch that. Though, the picture for Radar is definitely from this episode, but the picture of Hawkeye and Chopper from when they had the gorilla suits a couple episodes ago. And not every picture is from this episode, like those two demonstrate. But I didn't catch that what the ending actually was until doing this retro review. And speaking of how this is a season finale and all that, next week should be coming out my compilation review of season 2, so stay tuned for that. Then I'll take a week off before I go on to season 3, so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this episode in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching my video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to give this video a like and share. Also, consider subscribing to my channel to stay up to date on all my latest content. In the meantime, thank you for watching, and as always, have a good day, a good night, wherever you are. May the force be with you, always.